Chapter 1, Phantom Wraith. Please don't kill me, I can give you anything. Atop a 100-story skyscraper, a terrified man pleaded desperately. Before him was the black muzzle of the gun. The one holding the gun was a cold woman in black. She looked at him without a flicker of emotion, as if looking at a dead man. Please don't kill me, don't. The man trembled and begged. This phantom wraith never shows mercy. Her lips barely moved, uttering those cold, heartless words. A small sound followed, and the man's eyes widened as he fell straight to the ground. She looked at the body on the ground, her expression unchanged, tucked the silenced gun into her waistband, and turned to walk out the door. At this moment, a beautiful smile bloomed on her previously cold face, as if she saw a happy future beckoning. Her foster father had promised her that this would be her last mission. Once completed, she could leave the assassin organization and become an ordinary person. To be an ordinary person, that was her greatest dream. Now she had done it. From now on, there would be no more Dark Veil's #1 assassin, Phantom Wraith, but only Charles Stone's wife, Lil Grace, an ordinary woman. She and Charles Stone would definitely live happily ever after. Thinking of this, the smile on her exquisite face deepened. Nearing the door, a figure suddenly flashed from behind a large pillar, catching her off guard and flustering her. Charles Stone. She gasped. Looking back, the body was still there, clear as day. Her face instantly paled, and she hurriedly said, Charles Stone, it's not what you think, please listen to my explanation, listen to my explanation. But the extraordinarily handsome man said nothing, only looked at her coldly, his eyes piercingly cold. The woman in black no longer had her cold, indifferent, and calm composure, but became frightened and uneasy. She looked at the man almost pleadingly. Charles Stone, don't look at me like that, I can't bear it. Tears welled up in her eyes. Why was he here? Why did he see her kill someone? Why was everything she painstakingly hid so miserably exposed in front of the person she loved? Why? He always had a warm smile on his face, like sunshine dispelling the darkness in her heart. He always looked at her with gentle eyes, making her willingly give up everything to follow him. Why was he looking at her so coldly now, why? Could the happiness that was almost within her reach fly away? She didn't want that. Can't bear it. The man looked at her coldly, his voice icy. The #1 assassin of Dark Veil, Phantom Wraith, whose name alone terrifies people, has a moment of weakness. What a joke. He pressed closer to her step by step, his cold eyes like venomous snakes coiling around her, making it hard for her to breathe, and she could only step back. Chapter 2, The Trial, Charles Stone. She called out helplessly, tears silently falling. In front of him, she was always weak, needing protection, unable to bear any hurt from him. Lil Grace, with her pure and innocent exterior, is actually the venomous Phantom Wraith. Lil Grace, you're a good actress. He looked at her with disgust, using a sarcastic and hateful tone with her for the first time. Charles Stone, I really didn't want to lie to you, but I was afraid you wouldn't want me anymore. I really love you, truly. The woman said through her tears. The tears on her beautiful face made her even more stunningly beautiful and moving. To be loved by the #1 assassin, Phantom Wraith, is truly an honor. The man said sarcastically, the disgust in his words making her heart ache. Charles Stone. The woman in black clutched his clothes, pleading earnestly, Charles Stone, didn't you say you loved me? Didn't you say we would be together forever? From today onwards, I won't be an assassin anymore, I won't kill anymore, I'll just be Lil Grace. Can we still live like before? Can we forget what you saw today? Can we start over, and forget what you saw today? The man flung her hand away in disgust and said coldly, you're so naive. How could I love you? You're venomous, killing people like ants, arbitrarily taking the lives of others. How could I accept a woman like that? No, no, it's not like that. Didn't you love me? If you love me, why can't you accept me? The woman hurriedly defended herself, trying to salvage her love. Love you? The man sneered. Did you think I really loved you? I was just testing you, because I wanted to confirm if you were Phantom Wraith. Those words of love were all lies. These words were like a bolt from the blue, making her unable to move, only feeling her mind blank, her heart aching so much that she could hardly breathe. Why? After a long time, she finally found her voice, asking shakily. Because Daniel Stone was my father. He looked at her, saying each word slowly. The hatred in his eyes shot out, as if wanting to tear her into pieces. She opened her eyes wide in horror, but felt darkness descend, unable to see anything. Daniel Stone, she remembered. 2 years ago, she accepted a mission to assassinate an important national figure, Daniel Stone. At that time, she had spent a lot of effort to personally shoot him dead. But she never expected that Charles Stone was his son. So he approached her to avenge his father. His gentle smile, his tender words, were all to deceive her. Because he just wanted to kill her. You should die. She stood still, watching with her own eyes as Charles Stone plunged a dagger into her chest. She heard the sound of the dagger cutting through skin and flesh, a sharp, piercing sound. She felt the blood flowing out, staining her black clothes, sticky. Yet she didn't feel pain, because the heartache was 1,000 times worse than physical pain. In her delirium, she remembered the day they first met. The rain poured down incessantly on this chaotic world, and she held an umbrella, struggling to carry a pile of documents in the rain. A moment of carelessness, and the documents in her arms fell to the ground, and she frantically picked them up. Suddenly, a pair of slender, white hands appeared in front of her, helping her pick up the documents in the rainwater. Chapter 3, Transmigration and Rebirth. Following that elegant hand, she lifted her gaze. Before her eyes appeared a gentle, jade-like face, the corners of the lips curved in an alluring smile, radiant as the sun. Just one glance, and her heart was ensnared. From then on, living for him, dying for him, she was willing to do it all. She had thought they would be together until their hair turned white. But secrets can't be kept forever, especially when she was the one who killed his father. Perhaps only death could end her sins. Only death could please him. Then, she was willing. As she closed her eyes and fell, the last thing she saw was his hate-filled gaze, devoid of the former gentleness and affection. In that moment, her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Perhaps, death was her best destination. She opened her stinging eyes in a daze, a faint light filtering through. Wasn't she dead? Why could she still see light? Am I not dead? She murmured. Miss, you're awake. You're finally awake. Boo-hoo. Miss, how could you die, how could you leave Lillian Moore? A voice, both joyful and choked with sobs, suddenly rang out. She looked up and saw a girl kneeling by the bed, clutching her clothes, her large, glistening eyes fixed on her, crying pitifully. Miss, don't seek death, don't leave Lillian Moore, she cried. What was happening? Confusion filled her mind. Looking back at the girl by the bed, she saw ancient-style clothing and a maid's hairstyle. Glancing around the room, though simple, it had a distinctly antique feel, a genuine room from the past. These were things she'd only seen in historical dramas. Where was she? Why was everything so strange? She moved her body, discovering an all-encompassing ache, devoid of strength. She could only ask hoarsely, "Where is this?" Hearing her mistress's question, the little maid quickly wiped her tears and replied, "This is Mrs. Boudoir." "Miss, you're finally awake," she finished, her small mouth crumpling, about to cry again. "Stop crying." She felt her scalp tingle. Why did she encounter such a crybaby? "Yes, Mississippi." The girl sobbed, trying to hold back her tears. She struggled to sit up. Seeing this, the little maid hurriedly helped her, placing a pillow behind her back. "Where is this?" "Why do you call me Miss?" she asked again. "Miss?" The little maid looked at her in astonishment. "What's wrong with you?" "Don't scare Lillian more. Lillian Moore will go find the old madam and beg them to find a doctor for Miss." Having said that, as if making up her mind, she scrambled up and ran out. "Old master, madam, Miss." She furrowed her brows, hearing these unfamiliar titles, then looked around the simple yet ancient room, her heart suddenly pounding. Could it be, she had transmigrated? "Come back," she called. Lillian Moore, who was reaching the door, turned back to look at her with a puzzled expression. "I'm all right, just forgot a few things," she explained, surprised at her own words. "Miss." Lillian Moore cried out, rushing to the bedside. She looked at her with sympathy, offering no questions, only stating, "This is the Windcloud Empire. You are the second daughter of Charles Harrington, the head of the Windcloud Empire. Your name is Margaret Harrington." The young maid assumed her mistress's memory loss stemmed from grief, her heart filled with pity. But when Margaret saw the maid's sympathetic expression, she found it amusing. When had the #1 assassin ever needed anyone's pity? Chapter 4, Windcloud Empire. She remained silent. Now, she no longer desired to be an assassin. Even the word itself filled her with disgust. "Give me a mirror." "Yes, Mississippi." Though puzzled by the request, the maid obediently complied, handing her a bronze mirror. Reflected in the bronze was a breathtaking beauty. Slender, delicate hands, skin as white as jade, finely arched brows, eyes clear as water, and lips as red as berries. Despite her pale complexion, her beauty was captivating. Phantom Wraith was astonished. This face was even more beautiful than her previous one. Such beauty, such a tragic fate. Why was she reborn with such a devastatingly beautiful face? She just wanted an ordinary life. To be an ordinary person, marry a good man, and live a simple, peaceful life. But with a face like this, her life was destined for anything but peace. She didn't like it, not one bit. "I'm tired. You may leave," she finally instructed, feeling a strange, unsettling turmoil within her. "Yes, Mississippi. Please, don't do anything foolish. If you need anything, call for Lillian Moore," Lillian Moore cautioned, her voice laced with concern. She nodded slightly, paying no mind to the maid's warning about foolish things. She leaned back against the bed, closing her eyes. Why hadn't she died? Why was she transported to the Windcloud Empire, a nation that never existed in history? She had longed for death, yet she was reborn in this strange way. Was the heavens mocking her? "Charles Stone, am I dead to you now? Do you still hate me?" If she could, she would never have chosen to be an assassin. She never wanted to kill so many people. But the cruel reality had offered her no choice, driving her to desperation. Now, reborn in this strange world, she promised him she would never kill again. She would live an honest life, atoning for her sins. Would that be enough? Could he ever forgive her? Her eyes snapped open. Her heightened senses alerted her to the aggressive approach of several people towards her room. Judging by the footsteps, there were 5 or 6 of them. As expected, moments later, the door burst open, and a group of people stormed in. Leading the group was a middle-aged man and woman. The man, with his protruding belly and fleshy face, wore luxurious robes that only accentuated his vulgarity rather than conveying any sense of nobility. Beside him stood a gaudily dressed woman, her thick makeup failing to conceal the wrinkles etched onto her face. Yet, one could still discern that in her youth, she must have been a beauty. But even the most stunning looks cannot withstand the relentless march of time. Trailing behind them was a slender, beautiful girl of 16 or 17, with smooth skin and classic features. However, the smug, gloating expression on her face detracted from her beauty. Chapter 5, the reason for suicide. Those following them, dressed as servants, also wore expressions of malicious glee. Margaret Harrington, you've grown increasingly bold, haven't you? Daring to take your own life, the man at the head of the group roared, his voice raspy and grating, causing the girl on the bed to frown. Indeed, Margaret. Hasn't your stepmother told you? How could you even contemplate suicide? Marrying Edward Harrington is a blessing. He's a distinguished prince of our Windcloud Empire, the very own brother of our current emperor. Becoming his concubine is like a sparrow transforming into a phoenix. You'll be showered with riches and honor, silks and jewels beyond measure. Such an opportunity is a dream come true, yet you're so ungrateful, so audacious as to attempt suicide. You've truly disappointed your stepmother, the noblewoman chided, her tone laced with sarcasm. Precisely, the beautiful girl chimed in. Your mother was a prostitute. The mere fact that you have the chance to marry Edward Harrington and become a princess is a stroke of immense fortune. That he doesn't despise you is a blessing in itself. Yet, you dare to scorn the prince. You truly have a death wish. She put on an air of haughty superiority, sneering. Even in death, you won't be allowed to die in our Harrington household. We cannot offend the Empress Dowager. Whether you like it or not, you will marry him, the middle-aged man bellowed furiously. My lord, please calm yourself. Anger is detrimental to your health, the heavily made-up woman soothed, then turned to the girl on the bed. Margaret, dear, stop this foolishness and agree to the marriage. This union is ordained by the Empress Dowager, it cannot be defied. Fortunately, your sister Elizabeth is also about to marry into the palace as the Emperor's concubine. Our Harrington family will finally gain the recognition we deserve. Rest assured, with us here, that Lord Harrington won't mistreat you. Phantom Wraith finally grasped the general situation. Margaret Harrington had truly attempted suicide because her parents were forcing her into a marriage with the prince. No wonder her neck and throat ached, she had tried to hang herself. What a dreadful way to choose to die. It was evident that Margaret Harrington was not cherished within this family. Why had such a supposedly glorious opportunity to become a princess fallen upon her? It sounded like this particular princess position was not an enviable one. You will stay here obediently and leave with your sister in 10 days for the wedding. If you dare attempt suicide again, don't blame me for being ruthless. I will kill Lillian Moore and send you both to the underworld to keep each other company, the middle-aged man threatened menacingly before storming off. My lord, wait for me, the middle-aged woman, with a triumphant glance at the silent Margaret Harrington, called out and hurried after the man. The 16 or 17-year-old girl, none other than Elizabeth Harrington, the eldest daughter of the Harrington household, approached Margaret Harrington with a sinister smile. Dear sister, just be a good girl and marry him. That way, you'll live a few more days. Who knows, maybe once you're at Harrington Manor, Lord Harrington won't kill you. Don't worry, as the Emperor's concubine, I'll certainly look after you. With that, she let out a triumphant laugh and departed. Only after everyone had left did Margaret Harrington close her eyes, resuming her rest. What a cruel family. Their daughter attempts suicide, and the father, instead of showing concern, shouts and threatens. The stepmother mocks, and the sister gloats. Faced with such a family, it would be better to be an orphan, like in her previous life. No wonder Margaret Harrington felt no attachment to this world and chose to die so readily. Chapter 6, the situation here, Miss, Lillian Moore stumbled in, crying out, did the master come here? Did he hit you? Did he do anything to you? Looking at Lillian Moore's worried, anxious face, Margaret Harrington felt a sliver of comfort. He didn't do anything to me. That's good. Lillian Moore breathed a sigh of relief, I thought the master would hit you again. Does he often hit me? Margaret asked, frowning. Huh. Lillian Moore was momentarily speechless, then stammered, "Not often, Mississippi. It's just that every time the master sees you, he's not happy, and sometimes he hits you." Sometimes? It seems this word is worth discussing. Lillian Moore, tell me about the situation here. Margaret instructed. From Lillian Moore's mouth, she learned that this place was the Windcloud Empire. The emperor's name was James Harrington, extraordinarily handsome, young and talented. The Windcloud Empire flourished under his leadership. Edward Harrington was his younger brother, incredibly handsome. However, he was cold-blooded, lecherous, and had countless wives and concubines in his mansion, but still unsatisfied, he continued to search for beautiful women all over the world. It was said that his women were cursed, living no more than half a year, some disappeared without a trace, not even their bodies could be found. Rumor had it that he killed them. Therefore, the daughters of good families in the Didi kingdom were afraid of him, no one wanted to marry him. For some unknown reason, this time the Empress Dowager bestowed a marriage decree, wanting the eldest daughter of the Harrington, Elizabeth Harrington, to enter the palace as a concubine, and the second daughter, Margaret Harrington, to marry Edward Harrington as his principal wife. It must be that the royal family wanted to draw the Harrington closer. After all, the Harrington was a lucrative piece of meat. The Harrington was the capital of the Didi kingdom, almost monopolizing 60% of the rice, fabric, and tavern businesses, nationwide. The head of the Harrington, Charles Harrington, had 3 sons and 2 daughters. He also had 10 wives and countless concubines. The first wife was the woman who had just arrived. She had a son and a daughter. Although she was no longer favored by Charles Harrington, her status in the Harrington was as firm as a rock, being the current matriarch, thanks to her children. Margaret Harrington's mother was originally a courtesan, bought by Charles Harrington, and very much loved. It was a pity that she died during childbirth. Therefore, Margaret Harrington was not favored from birth, bullied by her siblings. The one who hated her the most was the eldest daughter, Elizabeth Harrington, who bullied her everywhere because she found Margaret Harrington more beautiful than herself. And Charles Harrington never paid attention. Margaret Harrington, although beautiful, was timid, fearful, and never dared to resist being bullied. From a young age she was the scapegoat of the Harrington. Her status in the mansion was not even as good as a servant. As soon as she heard that she had to marry the bloodthirsty Edward Harrington, she was so frightened that she hanged herself. Therefore, phantom wraith from another world entered her body, reborn. Having encountered this once-in-a-millennium opportunity for rebirth, then she should live well. Perhaps, she would have a completely different life. From now on. She was no longer the #1 assassin of the underworld, Phantom Wraith, nor was she the screen star Lil Grace. She was the unfavored second daughter of the Harrington, of the Windcloud Empire, Margaret Harrington. "Miss, do you really want to marry the prince?" Chapter 7, Escape from Marriage. 3 days later, as Margaret Harrington sat on a chaise lounge in the courtyard, enjoying the cool air, Lillian Moore couldn't help but ask. "Yes." Margaret Harrington replied softly, still sitting there listlessly. But in her mind, she had other plans. "But miss, people say, I know." She interrupted Lillian Moore, "I've decided on this matter, and I won't mention it again." Why did Miss's words sound so cold? She always felt something had changed since Miss woke up. The Miss of the past was very timid and cowardly, only obeying the master and crying when bullied. But after waking up, she seemed different. Although the young woman didn't resist the master and still quietly stayed in the courtyard waiting to get married, she always felt that Miss had changed, especially her eyes. Before, Miss's eyes were always fearful and timid like a little rabbit. But now, Miss's eyes were calm and indifferent, as if she didn't care about anything. Sometimes they were as sharp as a knife, making people tremble. Did dying once really have such a big impact on Miss? Margaret Harrington lay on the chaise lounge, feeling lost. Charles Stone's deception and betrayal had left her mentally and physically exhausted. How could a woman with blood on her hands like her find love? She should have been enjoying her new life. But she didn't expect to get married so soon. It didn't matter who she married, but she didn't want another man in her life yet. She wasn't one to accept fate, so she was planning to run away from this marriage. Now she was just assessing the situation and waiting for an opportunity. It had been 3 days since she arrived here, and during these 3 days, that father of hers didn't pay attention to her, but instead sent some servants to guard the courtyard entrance to prevent her from escaping. What a loving father. She wasn't fussy or demanding, life was quite peaceful. The wound on her neck had healed, and her strength was gradually returning. But this body was very soft, incomparable to her previous strong body. Escaping from here, however, was still as easy as pie for her. On the 5th night, a small, black figure emerged from Margaret Harrington's room, quickly crossing the large garden, and swiftly reaching the wall. Gripping the protruding stones, she quickly climbed out of the Harrington estate. The imperial city was quiet at night, every house had fallen asleep, accumulating energy for the next day's life. On the quiet street, a small black shadow looked particularly conspicuous under the bright moonlight, moving slowly, aimlessly, and looking utterly lonely. She was accustomed to the darkness. It could be said that she always lived in the darkness. Her identity was unknown to the public, and her person was even more invisible. She always lurked in the shadows, delivering a fatal blow to the enemy at any moment. Just like her name, Phantom Wraith, ghosts lived in the darkness. But why did she feel so uneasy tonight? She had never been as confused as she was tonight, not knowing who she was, let alone where she would eventually go. The vast sky, in this strange world, where was her destination? Chapter 8, Skyborn Butterfly. Charles Stone, you are gone, yet why does my heart feel so empty? You once warmed my heart, dispelled the gloomy darkness, for I knew that no matter how dark the world became, you would still keep a flickering lamp for me, lighting my way back. But why did you cruelly snatch everything away, leaving me like a kite with a broken string? Even though I'm alive, I don't know which direction to return to. Our relationship, from the moment we met to when our hearts and minds aligned, then fell deeply in love, was only a short year, but why did I fall so deeply in love with you? I clearly knew that everything you gave was fake, the gentle care was just an illusion, the sweet words were just lies, yet my heart still aches endlessly, as if falling into a quagmire with no way out. I shouldn't run away. Even if I leave Harrington Estate, where would I go? Everywhere is the same. I no longer have any expectations for romantic love, getting married sooner or later is the same, whoever I marry, I still have to get married, right? So why run away? Hey, miss, what are you doing wandering outside so late at night? Are you missing your lover? A teasing voice suddenly rang in my ears. Margaret Harrington looked up, not knowing when, a tall man was standing in front of her, casting a huge shadow under the moonlight. Get lost. She coldly uttered 2 words, a chill radiating around her. Her mood was terrible right now. Oh, still talking tough. The man exclaimed as if in admiration, and in a flash, he was in front of her. He reached out and squeezed her chin, lifting it up, revealing her face under the moonlight. The pale moonlight shone on her delicate face, further enhancing her stunning beauty. Her hair was as black as clouds, her skin as smooth as mist, her willow-like eyebrows like the crescent moon at the beginning of the month, her lips as red as ripe cherries, her eyes as beautiful as stars, carrying a hint of surprise, a hint of coldness. A faint fragrance emanated from her body. Under the moonlight, she became even more mysterious, elegant like a fairy, like a celestial being descending to earth. The man in black was momentarily stunned, couldn't help but admire her, and said with a smile, unexpectedly, "It's a little beauty, Margaret Harrington was startled. She didn't expect this man to be so agile. In the blink of an eye he was in front of her, like a phantom wraith. She didn't have time to react before he grabbed her chin. When she came to her senses, she pushed his hand away, stepped back a few steps, and glared at him. The close proximity allowed her to see his face clearly. His face was fairly decent, but it carried a wicked and mocking expression, and his eyes gleamed with a fervent gaze like a wild beast. One look and you could tell he was a lecher. Margaret Harrington frowned, very uncomfortable. "Hey, miss, I like your feisty personality," the man teased, reaching out to grab her. Margaret Harrington nimbly dodged. She coldly asked, "Who are you?" "Who am I?" The man laughed heartily and said, "I am the famous sky-born butterfly, little beauty, you can't escape from my hands today." As he spoke, he lunged towards her like a hungry wolf. Margaret Harrington quickly dodged, thinking to herself, "Sky-born butterfly?" Although she didn't know much about ancient times, she knew from movies that people in the old days liked to give themselves nicknames. Looking at this man's despicable appearance, wandering around outside at night, he was definitely not a good person. ####Chapter 9, The thief. Her mood was foul tonight, so she decided to teach him a lesson he wouldn't forget. She wasn't someone to be trifled with. With that thought, she stopped dodging and launched an attack. But she made a fatal mistake. The martial arts of the ancients were profound and unfathomable, far exceeding her imagination. Her skills were useless against them. In just a few moves, the man had her limbs locked, holding her captive in his embrace. Margaret Harrington was astonished. Although this body was frail, her martial arts shouldn't be this weak. She struggled violently, but suddenly felt her whole body stiffen, unable to move. Her eyes widened in terror. "Haha, little beauty, don't be afraid, I've only sealed your pressure points. I'll release you later when we arrive," the man whispered in her ear, his teasing words disgusting Margaret Harrington. He chuckled, nibbling her ear lightly, then wrapped his arm around her slender waist, soaring into the air, landing on the roof, and gliding towards the darkness. Margaret Harrington stared in disbelief. Was this the legendary lightness skill? Late at night, a wide river flowed silently, its surface shimmering silver under the moonlight. The trees along the bank cast shadows on the rippling water. Suddenly, a dark figure swept past, shattering the night's tranquility. The figure stopped beneath a willow tree by the river, abruptly throwing a slender form from within the darkness, which landed on the grass by the bank. "Release me, or you'll regret it." Margaret Harrington lay on the grass, immobilized, her voice cold. Truthfully, panic gnawed at her. It had been years since she'd been controlled like this. She was always the one in control, toying with others. She never expected to be restrained by a thief in this place. Especially being completely unable to move, it was both humiliating and frustrating. "Little beauty, don't be impatient, your brother is coming," the man said, his voice laced with suggestive undertones as he undressed. A flicker of panic crossed Margaret Harrington's eyes. "Release my pressure points," she demanded. "Don't worry, your brother will certainly fulfill your request later. Let me go, or I'll call for help." Margaret Harrington shouted angrily. She never thought she'd be like a weak woman, uttering such useless words. The man pressed down on her, sneering, "Go ahead and yell. There are no houses near the Cloudwater River. Even if you shout until your throat is raw, no one will come to save you. Be a good girl and listen to your brother, and maybe I'll release your pressure points." "Shameless," she cursed. "I've always been shameless, little beauty. Consider yourself enlightened." Margaret Harrington felt disgusted and utterly helpless. She could only close her eyes, unwilling to witness what was about to happen. Suddenly, the surrounding air shifted. A powerful chill descended, as if abruptly transitioning from a warm spring to a frigid winter. The sudden change caused Margaret Harrington to open her eyes, but the man on top of her seemed oblivious to the approaching danger. Margaret Harrington remained silent, waiting. Chapter 10, Rescued. Sure enough, a gleaming throwing knife, trailing a cold light, sliced through the air, embedding itself directly into the villain's back. He screamed in pain, rolling to the side. Gritting his teeth against the agony, he scrambled up from the ground, roaring, "Who? Who is it?" His words were cut short as another throwing knife, laced with icy coldness, shot towards him like lightning, embedding itself in the center of his forehead. The villain's eyes widened, his body falling backward, motionless on the ground. From beneath the canopy of a riverside tree, a tall figure emerged. Even from a distance, Margaret Harrington could sense the chilling aura emanating from him. He strode towards the corpse, each step radiating a sharp, imposing presence. "Skyborn butterfly." "Humph." A frigid voice echoed like a 1,000-year-old glacier, laced with unparalleled contempt and arrogance. "This man is powerful." That was Margaret Harrington's first thought. She remained silent, lying on the ground, observing the tall man before her. In the darkness, she couldn't discern his features, only his imposing height and ink-black hair. But he didn't look at her, seemingly unaware of her presence. Glancing at the body on the ground, he turned to leave. "Wait." Seeing him about to depart, Margaret Harrington called out. Her clothes disheveled, unable to move, she had no choice but to plead for his help. The man stopped, turning back to look at her. Under the cold moonlight, Margaret Harrington saw his deep eyes, like a star-studded night sky, yet chillingly sharp and piercing. Margaret Harrington shivered slightly. This was a ruthless, cold-blooded, and bloodthirsty man. "What is it?" An icy voice cut through the silent night, carrying a bone-chilling coldness. His gaze swept over her, completely indifferent to her disheveled state. "I've been pressure-pointed." "Help me release the acupoints," Margaret Harrington said coldly, irritation rising within her. Was he blind? Couldn't he see a damsel in distress lying here? The man stood motionless for a long moment. Though she couldn't see his expression, Margaret Harrington guessed he was frowning, his face etched with displeasure. After a long silence, he walked towards her, bent down, and swiftly released her acupoints. He then immediately stood up and turned to leave. The brief proximity allowed Margaret Harrington to clearly see his perfect features. This man was strikingly handsome, yet cold as ice. Margaret Harrington quickly sat up, adjusting her disheveled clothes. Then, she called after him, "Who are you? I owe you a favor. I will repay you." But the man ignored her, simply shifting his weight and vanishing into the darkness. Margaret Harrington's jaw dropped once again in astonishment. Ancient martial arts were truly bizarre. Pressure points, lightfoot techniques, nothing was ordinary. She stood up, her gaze cold as she looked at the corpse with its eyes still wide open, her hands clenched into fists. This humiliation made her realize that to survive in this strange land, she had to become strong. Otherwise, she could only seek a protector. Turning, she walked towards Harrington Estate. Now, she had decided to marry. Before attaining supreme martial arts prowess, becoming a princess wasn't a bad option. June 10th, the day the two Harrington sisters were married. This union with the royal family was a tremendous honor for the Harrington estate, and Lord Harrington took it very seriously. The long corridors of Harrington Estate were brilliantly adorned with crimson lanterns. Fresh red paint coated the pillars, and red silk, flowers, and lanterns hung from every building, courtyard, and even the branches of the trees. Servants in bright red wedding attire bustled about the grounds, attending to the congratulatory guests. Chapter 11, Wedding Day. Before dawn, Margaret Harrington was roused from her bed by a flurry of maids and nurses. Bathing, dressing, hair styling, makeup. All morning, Margaret felt like a wooden puppet, manipulated by others. Although Margaret Harrington was the less favored second daughter of the Harrington estate, this marriage was decreed by the Empress Dowager, to wed her to the powerful Hao Wang as his principal wife. Therefore, the Harringtons dared not neglect any detail. While bidding farewell to her parents, Margaret saw her sister, Elizabeth Harrington, also to be wed that day. Elizabeth, adorned in glamorous makeup, stood before Lord and Lady Harrington, coquettishly seeking their favor. Seeing Margaret enter, she glared. Elizabeth Harrington was chosen as a concubine for the Emperor. There would be no grand wedding ceremony for her, only a palanquin to carry her to the palace. Her wedding couldn't compare to Margaret's. Margaret, at least, would have an 8-man palanquin. This fueled Elizabeth's resentment, and her expression towards her soon-to-be princess sister was anything but pleasant. Margaret didn't rise to her sister's bait. She refused to engage in such childish games. Only when seated in the bridal palanquin did Margaret finally have a moment to breathe. She had always found ancient wedding customs intriguing, but now she only felt weary. The joyous clamor of the commoners outside held no interest for her. It wasn't Edward Harrington himself who came to escort her today, but a general under his command. Clearly, Edward wasn't thrilled about this marriage. But it didn't matter, Margaret only sought refuge, a peaceful life. His attitude was irrelevant. The swaying palanquin made her head spin. Charles Stone, I yearned for the day I would be your bride, yet here I am, in another man's wedding palanquin. If you knew, what would you think? Would you be jealous? Would you be heartbroken? Probably not. Because you never loved me. A tear escaped, startling her. She thought she had let go of everything, so why the tears? Why did her heart still ache with such intensity, making it hard to breathe? Soon, the palanquin arrived at the royal mansion. In a daze, she was led directly to the bridal chamber, bypassing even the wedding ceremony. Though the red veil obscured her vision, she felt no hint of wedding joy. She sat by the bed, waiting. Late into the night, footsteps finally echoed from beyond the door. Steady, measured steps, each one a beat against her heart. Margaret knew it was Edward Harrington, her husband. The door creaked open. The respectful voices of the maids and matrons within the room followed. Your Highness. Leave. A cold male voice echoed, startling Margaret Harrington. She felt like she had heard this voice somewhere before. Yes, Your Highness. Everyone in the room filed out, and the door closed behind them. Now alone in the large room, the atmosphere grew strange. Margaret Harrington sat quietly on the bed, her vision obscured by the red veil. She could feel the cold emanating from the man and smell the faint scent of alcohol in the air. The man stepped closer, the smell of alcohol growing stronger. Finally, a pair of polished black leather shoes stopped before her. Suddenly, her vision cleared as the veil was swept from her head. A slender, pale hand grasped her chin, lifting her lowered face. Instantly, a breathtakingly handsome, masculine face filled her sight, stealing her breath. Chapter 12 Edward Harrington. Before her stood a cold man, his features perfect, like a meticulously sculpted work of art. Fair skin, thick eyebrows furrowed slightly above eyes as sharp as a hawk's, black as ink, yet icy and piercing. He looked at her coldly, his eyes holding nothing but coldness and disgust. His innate regal aura and the chill radiating from him were more terrifying than hell itself. But Margaret Harrington stared back, momentarily frozen. She remembered those starbright yet icy eyes, and those handsome features she had only seen once before. So, he was the man who had saved her on the banks of the Cloudwater River a few days ago, the man she owed a debt to. He was the Emperor's younger brother, the man who held immense power in the Windcloud Empire. He was the bloodthirsty, murderous phantom wraith that the women of the Windcloud Empire avoided like the plague. No wonder he possessed such a powerful aura. But clearly, he didn't recognize her. A red wedding robe enveloped his tall, perfect figure, making him appear even more imposing and majestic. In the modern world, Margaret Harrington had seen countless men, but none as handsome as this. No wonder, even knowing that following him meant facing death, countless women still vied for his attention. He had the capital to attract women. If it weren't for Charles Stone, perhaps she would also be interested in such a man. Edward Harrington coldly observed the woman before him. Beneath the magnificent phoenix crown was an exquisitely beautiful face, her raven hair neatly styled with a gold hairpin, its long tassels shimmering. Her eyes were bright as water, her eyebrows curved like a crescent moon, her lips full and red, her teeth white as jade, her skin as white as snow. Truly a beauty among 10,000. Too bad she was a spy sent by her. No matter how beautiful, she was just a venomous snake. Thinking of this, his eyes grew colder, and a faint, wicked smile played on his lips. Indeed, a beauty, truly worthy of being chosen by my beloved mother. Margaret Harrington noted the emphasis he placed on the word beloved, but didn't understand the hidden meaning. It sounded like a compliment, yet she felt incredibly uncomfortable. She didn't miss the disgust and mockery that flashed in his eyes as he spoke. "Your Highness, you're drunk," she said coldly, dodging his hand on her chin. "Humph," Edward Harrington sneered. "Today is my wedding day. My mother and my brother have come to congratulate me. I am joyful, how could I be drunk?" For some reason, Margaret Harrington sensed a hidden sadness and loneliness in his cold words. Suddenly, she felt ridiculous. He was just a stranger who had saved her once, why should she care about his mood? How foolish. Lost in her self-mockery, her vision suddenly darkened as Edward Harrington kissed her. She reached up, wrapped her arms around his head, and suddenly struck him on the back of the neck. The man instantly collapsed against her, motionless. Margaret Harrington pushed the feverish man away, huddled in a corner of the bed, and covered her wounded body with the blanket, feeling empty inside. "Charles Stone, without you, I don't care about any other man. Before the wedding, I knew this was inevitable, but why did I choose to run away at the last minute?" Her gaze fell on the unconscious man, his features sculpted, his eyes long and deep, his nose high, his lips pressed tightly together. Under the soft candlelight, he looked truly handsome, a rare find. But why did his touch disgust her? To the point of being unbearable. "Charles Stone, how deeply have I been poisoned by you? To the point of loathing another's touch so much." Chapter 13, Using kindness. Margaret Harrington sat silently on the bed for a long time, then wrapped herself in the bedsheet, stood up, and sat in front of the vanity mirror. She applied a thick layer of powder to her face and drew heavy eyebrows. In the blink of an eye, a breathtaking beauty transformed into an ordinary, vulgar woman. Satisfied, she returned to the bed. After a moment of thought, she bit her fingertip, dripped a few drops of blood onto the pristine white sheet, and then snuggled up against the sleeping man. Edward Harrington opened his eyes to the daylight. The remnants of his drunkenness caused a throbbing headache. He rubbed his forehead and sat up. As he moved, he noticed a soft object beside him. Turning his head, he saw a woman soundly asleep, clutching the blanket. How could he forget? Yesterday was his wedding day, and this was the bride his mother had painstakingly chosen for him. He vaguely recalled being completely drunk last night, stumbling into the bridal chamber, seeing a beautiful woman, and kissing her. The rest was a blur. Now, looking at the woman's face, he felt an immediate wave of disgust. Her face was covered in a thick layer of powder, as if it would flake off with the slightest touch. Her eyebrows were thick and black, messy and shapeless. Last night, he must have been utterly blind to have found her stunningly beautiful. Looking at the marks on her bare skin, a wave of revulsion washed over him. Such a vulgar, ordinary woman. He quickly got up, moving away from the woman on the bed. But he felt a slight pain in his neck. What was that about? It seemed he really couldn't drink so much in the future, lest something happen. Usually, he could hold his liquor no matter how much he drank. Why did he have no memory of last night? Could she have done something? He glanced at the woman on the bed again, his disgust intensifying. A timid woman like a mouse, what could she possibly do? It seemed he was overthinking. He shouldn't have drunk so much last night. He called the maid outside to help him change his clothes. After getting ready, he looked at the woman on the bed, still asleep. What a pig! He gave her a look of disgust and turned to stride away. As he left, he didn't notice the woman on the bed opening her clear eyes, calmly watching his back disappear. Her expression was cold and alert, with no trace of drowsiness. As soon as Edward Harrington left, Lillian Moore rushed in. "Miss," she called anxiously. Margaret Harrington didn't say a word, getting up and dressing herself, dragging her slightly aching body out of bed. Although Edward Harrington hadn't taken advantage of her last night, his rough actions had still caused her pain. The man was like a ferocious beast, difficult to deal with. Seeing this, Lillian Moore quickly brought in clean water and helped her wash her face. Then, she combed and styled her hair. She didn't dare ask too many questions about last night. Before, her mistress had been timid and fragile, confiding everything in her. But since her mistress had awakened, although still quiet, she had become much more stern. Sometimes, just a glance from her mistress was enough to frighten her. But it seemed the prince was still good to her mistress, not as fearsome as the rumors outside suggested. As long as her mistress was all right, she would be at ease. Lillian Moore had skillful hands, quickly arranging her mistress's long black hair into a dignified bun befitting a married woman. "Miss, you are so beautiful." Lillian Moore couldn't help but exclaim, looking at the breathtaking beauty before her. Chapter 14, The Pretense. The bronze mirror reflected a young woman with a porcelain-white, translucent face, skin as smooth as jade, and cherry-red lips, luscious and glistening. Her gaze was serene, like a still, unrippled lake. Her sleek black hair was neatly pinned up, adorned with a gold butterfly hairpin, making her resemble an ethereal celestial being, elegant and alluring, refined yet noble. Even Margaret Harrington was momentarily captivated. "Such beauty, the prince will surely treat you well," Lillian Moore exclaimed joyfully. Margaret Harrington's eyes darkened. What good was beauty without Charles Stone? Besides, she would never rely on her looks to win someone over. She had never valued a man who loved her solely for her appearance. Glancing at the jewelry box on the dressing table, she saw it filled with exquisite pieces. Her father wasn't entirely stingy. She grabbed a handful of jewels and declared, "Put them all on me." "My lady, there's no need, these are enough." "Put them on," Margaret Harrington said coldly. "Yes." Intimidated by her tone, Lillian Moore dared not argue and adorned her hair with the pile of jewelry. The elegant bun instantly transformed into a gaudy, peacock-like mess. Margaret Harrington picked up the powder box and applied the same unsightly makeup as the night before. Just as she finished, a maid arrived, summoning the princess to the main hall for breakfast. When Margaret Harrington arrived, everyone was already present. Had she not known about Edward Harrington's bevy of beauties, she would have thought she'd walked into a brothel. The women in the hall were of all shapes and sizes, some slender and graceful, others plump and full-figured. Two flamboyant women currently flanked Edward Harrington. One, dressed in pink, sat on his left, acting coquettish. On his right sat a classic beauty with delicate features and sparkling eyes, occasionally stealing shy glances at the handsome man beside her, feigning vulnerability. The other women were equally stunning. Edward Harrington sat there coldly, his face expressionless, radiating an air of aloofness. Despite being surrounded by a sea of beauties, he remained composed. Margaret Harrington couldn't help but admire his composure. The women, upon seeing Margaret Harrington, merely glanced at her without curtsying. Noticing her garish makeup and the chaotic jumble of hairpins, they sneered with disdain and a hint of smugness. Seemingly oblivious, Margaret Harrington walked forward gracefully and curtsied. "Your Highness," she greeted. Edward Harrington glanced at her, sneering with disgust. "After breakfast, accompany me to the palace." "Yes, Your Highness," she replied obediently, then proceeded to an empty seat at the round table, far from Edward Harrington. As Edward Harrington's wife, these concubines should have offered her tea and curtsied. But it was clear they didn't consider her their superior. Margaret didn't mind. She had no desire to join their petty squabbles. "Your Highness, your sister's hairstyle is so unique. I've never seen anything like it," the woman in pink on Edward Harrington's left said with a seductive laugh. Chapter 15, Generosity. Such a difference, indeed. "Look, every piece of Princess Margaret's jewelry is worth a king's ransom." Seeing Edward Harrington's lack of response, the classically beautiful woman on his right boldly continued. "Indeed. Princess Margaret, as the daughter of the Harrington of Ditty Kingdom's capital, naturally has the finest things. Unlike Emily, who comes from a humble family, how could she possess such priceless hair ornaments?" The woman in pink feigned distress, glancing pitifully at Edward Harrington. "Is Emily implying that I treat her poorly?" Edward Harrington gripped her chin, his voice icy. "I wouldn't dare." Emily trembled under his frigid gaze, quickly lowering her eyes. In a small voice, she replied, "To be favored by your lordship is a blessing cultivated over several lifetimes. I wouldn't dare harbor such impertinent thoughts." Edward Harrington snorted, releasing her chin. "After the meal, find the steward and have him select some jewelry for you from the treasury." "Thank you, your lordship." The woman in pink beamed, offering her gratitude. Seeing this, the other women chimed in with their own requests. "Your lordship, I desire some as well." "Your lordship, me too." "Everyone shall receive a share," Edward Harrington declared generously. "Thank you, your lordship." The women expressed their gratitude in unison. "This lord is truly generous." Margaret Harrington scoffed inwardly. No wonder so many women clung to such a dangerous iceberg, it turned out he had deep pockets. "Serve the meal," Edward Harrington commanded. Breakfast was swiftly presented, and the women sat demurely, eating in silence. It seemed this lord preferred tranquility during meals. Throughout the meal, Edward Harrington did not address Margaret Harrington, as if he had forgotten her presence entirely. But this was precisely what Margaret Harrington desired. She did not love him and had little interest in him. She owed him a favor, which she would repay when the opportunity arose. After breakfast, Edward Harrington escorted Margaret Harrington to the palace to express their gratitude. Reaching the carriage waiting at the main gate, Edward Harrington looked at Margaret Harrington's pitiful face with disgust. "The daughter of Charles Harrington is truly different," he sneered. Then, raising his voice, he called, "Bring my horse." Mounting the steed a servant led forward, he rode off without waiting for Margaret Harrington. "Miss," Lillian Moore called out anxiously. How could the lord simply abandon her mistress? Margaret Harrington watched his retreating figure impassively, her face betraying no emotion as she entered the carriage, leaving a worried and helpless Lillian Moore behind. When Margaret Harrington arrived at the palace gates, Edward Harrington was already waiting, accompanied by his close guard, Henry Fletcher. Upon her arrival, Edward Harrington said nothing, his face expressionless as he proceeded forward. Margaret Harrington and Lillian Moore followed. In her past life, everyone called her the Ice Beauty, her entire being like a 1,000-year-old glacier. Only now, in this place, did Margaret Harrington understand what true ice was, the frigid aura emanating from the man walking ahead. Arriving at the Celestial Hall, where the Emperor resided, they found the Emperor, the Empress, and Elizabeth Harrington, who had entered the palace the previous day and was now styled as Elizabeth. Upon entering the palace, Margaret Harrington quietly observed them. The Empress, gentle and dignified, Elizabeth Harrington, charming and lovely. And the monarch, refined and elegant, handsome, with no trace of the majesty and ruthlessness of an emperor, but rather resembling a gentle scholar. This was far from what Margaret Harrington had previously imagined. She had originally thought that with a cold and domineering younger brother like Edward Harrington, this older brother would definitely be cruel and bloodthirsty, but unexpectedly, he was a gentle man, like Jade. Truly a misconception. #### Chapter 16, Entering the palace, the two performed their obeisances. Your subject brother greets imperial brother, Imperial Sister-in-law, and Lady Elizabeth. Your subject greets your Majesty, Your Highness the Empress, and Lady Elizabeth. James Harrington, who deeply loved his younger brother, was overjoyed to see him and his princess arrive, and said with a smile, "Rise, be seated." "Thank you, Your Majesty." The two replied, then sat down in the chairs beside them. "You are Margaret Harrington, Elizabeth's younger sister." James Harrington looked at Margaret Harrington, who kept her head bowed, and asked gently. "Yes, Your Majesty." Margaret Harrington bowed her head, her body trembling slightly, and replied in a low voice, deliberately feigning timidity and weakness. Seeing her unconvincing reaction, a flicker of disgust flashed in Edward Harrington's eyes, while James Harrington merely smiled magnanimously. Beside the Emperor, Elizabeth Harrington, in her splendid attire, with a gleam of gloating in her eyes, feigned intimacy and said, "Sister, you must raise your head when answering His Majesty, otherwise it's disrespectful." In truth, she hated this useless younger sister to death. A bastard child born of a prostitute, yet married to such a handsome prince, how could she not be enraged? But seeing her timid and frightened appearance, she secretly gloated. Such a foolish woman, how could the dignified and handsome Lord Harrington possibly take notice of her? Soon, she would either be killed by Lord Harrington or banished to the cold palace. She, the elder sister, eagerly awaited her fate. "Sister, Margaret may be entering the palace for the first time, it's understandable that she's a little frightened, don't be too harsh." The Empress, beside the Emperor, with a gentle smile on her face, said to Elizabeth Harrington. However, upon closer inspection, the smile on her lips didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, I understand." Elizabeth Harrington bowed her head obediently and replied, but a flicker of hatred flashed in her eyes. This hateful Empress, opposing her in every way, showing off her authority as soon as she entered the palace. "But don't be so arrogant, I will definitely make you pay later." Margaret Harrington silently observed the expressions of the two, sneering inwardly. Just entered the palace, and they were already fighting. It seemed the palace was indeed a battlefield for women. "Sister-in-law, don't be nervous, just treat this as your own home." The Emperor spoke gently, then turned to Edward Harrington, his tone serious. "Edward, now that you have a princess, you must exercise restraint in the future, stop causing trouble, and assist your imperial brother in handling state affairs, that is the right path." Causing trouble? He must be referring to Edward Harrington's womanizing. Edward Harrington turned his head to the side, silent, as if sulking. Margaret Harrington was quite surprised by this reaction. Why did she feel like her great husband was acting like a spoiled child? And towards the Emperor, no less. The Emperor sighed helplessly, then turned to Margaret Harrington with a gentle and polite smile. "My imperial brother has been mischievous since childhood, I hope you will be more forgiving." Why was this Emperor so gentle, speaking softly, without any of the sternness of a monarch? Margaret Harrington raised her head, carefully assessing the elegant man in bright yellow robes on the throne. Indeed, he had the same handsome features as Edward Harrington, but he was refined and gentle, exuding an aura of warmth and cheerfulness. Completely different from Edward Harrington's cold and gloomy aura. As she raised her head, she revealed her face, gaudily made up and unbearably ugly. Her hair was cluttered with gold ornaments, turning her black hair into a crow's nest, looking like someone who had suddenly become rich. Her large, dark eyes looked at the Emperor, then she spoke softly and timidly, "I wouldn't dare." Chapter 17, Brotherly Affection. King James Harrington's face stiffened, the gentle smile vanishing. Queen Elizabeth Harrington, equally composed, was also taken aback by Margaret's attire. Elizabeth, however, didn't dwell on it, a flicker of satisfaction crossing her features. The more unsightly Margaret appeared, the more Elizabeth rejoiced. Edward Harrington, observing everyone's reactions, especially his brother's, found the situation rather amusing. After a long pause, the king finally regained his composure, his lips twitching as he said, "Sister-in-law, this is your first time in the palace, you haven't visited the royal gardens, have you? Perhaps the Queen and Elizabeth could escort you. My queen, he called, completely disregarding Margaret's opinion, as if eager to have her out of sight. The Queen, understanding his intent, replied, "Yes, your Majesty." She rose and approached Margaret, taking her hand with feigned gentleness. "Sister, please come with me." Margaret nodded, following the Queen and Elizabeth out of the celestial hall. Only the two brothers, James and Edward Harrington, remained. James, unable to contain himself any longer, asked agitatedly, "Edward, what is the meaning of this? Weren't we told that Charles Harrington's daughter was a refined lady, possessing both beauty and talent? What is this?" It was based on this description that he had agreed to the marriage arranged by their mother. The beauty they spoke of is Charles Harrington's eldest daughter. This is his second daughter, born to a courtesan who died during childbirth. She's been neglected since childhood, treated worse than a servant at Harrington Estate. Her existence is practically unknown outside the estate. Edward leaned back in his chair, casually relaying the results of his recent investigation. It was evident that he held a great deal of patience for his elder brother, his usual coldness replaced by a gentler demeanor. So, not only is she not beautiful and talented, but she's also simple. Yes, Edward's lips curled into a self-deprecating smile. Now the entire Diddy kingdom knows I've married an exceptionally unattractive woman. They're all laughing at me. Did mother know about this beforehand? The king asked, his face darkening. I don't know. Edward was equally perplexed. Why would their mother choose such a woman for him? If she wanted someone to monitor him, wouldn't a clever woman be more suitable? Was marrying a simpleton meant to ruin his reputation? Did she not realize he never cared for such superficialities? I'll ask mother what she's playing at. James roared, his handsome face turning livid. He stood up, about to storm out. Brother, wait. Edward stopped him. Seeing his brother pause, he pleaded, don't upset her. She treats you like this, and you still defend her. James shouted, his frustration palpable. Edward lowered his head, remaining silent. The king followed suit. Edward, I'm sorry you've been wronged, the king said after a long silence. Perhaps, you should divorce her. I'll find you a woman of true virtue and talent. Brother, there's no need, Edward said with a bitter laugh. Women are all the same to me. I don't care who my princess is. The king sighed. Do as you wish. I won't interfere any further. As long as you're happy. Thank you, brother, Edward said gratefully. In this world, only his brother truly cared for him. He would dedicate his life to supporting and repaying his brother's kindness. You haven't seen mother yet, have you? You should go, the king said after a moment. Yes, Edward replied, turning to leave. Chapter 18, Visiting the Empress Dowager. The emperor watched his retreating figure, melancholy coloring his features, and an unending pity shone in his dark eyes. This younger brother has truly suffered. What can I do to help him? Sister, it's only early summer now, and the flowers in the garden are in full bloom. If you like, you can come and stroll around often, and it just so happens you can keep me company and chat. In the imperial garden, Queen Wang spoke softly to Margaret Harrington, who remained silent. Yes, thank you, Your Majesty. Margaret Harrington lowered her head and replied demurely. Inwardly, she thought, only a ghost would willingly enter the palace. Everyone knows the palace is a place where people are devoured without a trace left. She couldn't avoid it fast enough. Seeing Margaret Harrington's timid reaction and looking at her frightening face, Queen Wang frowned, very displeased. She felt sorry for Edward Harrington. After all, Edward Harrington was a powerful and prestigious prince, extraordinarily handsome, the dream man of countless maidens. Why did he marry such an ugly woman? Truly a flower stuck in dung. Of course, Margaret Harrington was the dung. But the emperor hadn't said anything about this princess, and as a woman, she couldn't gossip. Otherwise, if she ruined the emperor's plans, she couldn't bear the consequences. Thinking of this, she smiled gently again and said, "Sister, the flowers over there are also very beautiful. Let's go and see them together." She then walked forward, with Margaret Harrington following closely behind. Margaret Harrington truly admired this gentle queen. She clearly loathed her to death, yet could still smile so tenderly. If she hadn't seen the flash of disgust and mockery in her eyes, she might have actually believed she was being treated like a sister. But it was good that they loathed her. It was best if all the important figures in the palace loathed her, so she wouldn't have to enter the palace again. She tried to appear timid, foolish, and ordinary, precisely to achieve this effect. It would be best if they urged Edward Harrington to divorce her, so she could go out and live her peaceful life. Strolling through the imperial garden for a while with little interest, listening to Queen Wang and Margaret Harrington bicker, Margaret Harrington felt incredibly bored. These women in the palace truly had nothing better to do than stir up trouble. Fortunately, after a while, Edward Harrington came to find her, finally rescuing her from these two fake women. Afterward, they went together to Sinang Palace to pay their respects to the Empress Dowager, who was also Edward Harrington's mother. Upon entering Sinang Palace, Margaret Harrington noticed the woman seated in the main position and quietly observed her. She wore luxurious clothes, her skin was fair, her face delicately made up, her figure well proportioned, and her demeanor noble. Just sitting there, she was like a luminous object, attracting everyone's gaze. Nearly 50 years old, yet she looked like she was only 30. No wonder James Harrington and Edward Harrington were so handsome. It turned out they had a beautiful mother. Your son greets mother. Your daughter-in-law greets mother. The two of them stepped forward and performed a curtsy. The woman in the presiding seat closed her eyes slightly, snorted coldly, feigning indifference. It seems like this queen mother doesn't like this son of hers very much. Margaret Harrington thought to herself. Chapter 19. The old hag Edward Harrington stood up straight. She followed suit, standing upright with her head bowed. You are Charles Harrington's second daughter. Raise your head and let me see you. A cold female voice echoed from above, as if carrying the chill of 1,000 years. Margaret Harrington thought, this woman's voice is truly cold, just like Edward Harrington's, like mother, like son. She trembled as she raised her head, meeting a pair of bright eyes, and pretended to flinch and avoid her gaze, but from the corner of her eye, she saw the Queen Mother's face wrinkle in disgust. Inwardly, she couldn't help but sneer. You are Charles Harrington's daughter? The Queen Mother asked again, unable to hide the disgust in her eyes. Yes, Mother, I am Charles Harrington's second daughter, Margaret Harrington. She replied softly, trembling. A gloomy glint flickered in the Queen Mother's eyes, a hint of complacency appearing on her face, but when she saw Edward Harrington standing beside her, observing coldly, she quickly regained her calm, impassive expression. She calmly asked, How are you satisfied with the marriage I arranged for you? A sharp glint flashed in her eyes. Mother, I am satisfied. Edward Harrington replied calmly, but his heart ached. Margaret Harrington quickly glanced at Edward Harrington, full of doubt. That's good. The Queen Mother said. Then she added, You may leave now. I have a few words to say to your princess in private. Yes, Mother. I'll take my leave. Edward Harrington bowed respectfully and withdrew. This mother and son are so strange. In everyone's eyes, Edward Harrington is tyrannical and overbearing, but in front of her, he's like a mouse meeting a cat, obedient and compliant. Yet, as his birth mother, the Queen Mother shows no affection towards him, on the contrary, her eyes cannot hide her disgust. Could it be that she isn't Edward Harrington's real mother? After Edward Harrington left, the Queen Mother stood up, walked over to her, and her sharp eyes swept over her. Then she sneered, heaven's star of misfortune, a harbinger of death for husband and kin. Truly different. Margaret Harrington's heart trembled involuntarily. What did that mean? The Queen Mother grabbed her chin, lifted it, and said, "What do you know? Can you read and write? Do you have any talents in singing or dancing?" Margaret Harrington suppressed the discomfort in her heart, put on a terrified expression, and said, I don't know." "Insolent!" she roared, and a slap landed on Margaret Harrington's face, knocking her head to the side. Instantly, 5 clear fingerprints appeared on her powdered face. "You must address me as, your servant, when speaking to me. You know nothing, you're truly useless. If it weren't for you being born at an auspicious hour, I wouldn't even bother looking at you," the Queen Mother said angrily. Then she threatened fiercely, "Listen here, you will keep an eye on Edward Harrington's every move for me. Report anything unusual to me. You'd best be obedient, or I'll make your life a living hell." "Yes, Your Majesty, I remember." Margaret Harrington knelt on the ground, trembling as she replied, but her eyes were as cold as frost. If she didn't want to cause trouble, she would definitely kill this old witch. "Get out." "Yes, Your Majesty." Margaret Harrington got up and trembled as she backed out. ####Chuang20, Heaven Star of Misfortune. Not far from Xianing Palace, Margaret Harrington saw a man in blue standing under a large tree in the distance, seemingly looking at something. His tall figure exuded a lonely sorrow. Her heart suddenly trembled. It seemed that this prince, outwardly glorious and boundless, as if omnipotent, also had his own sorrows. She unconsciously recalled the Empress Dowager's words, "Heaven's star of misfortune, cursed to kill husband and sons." What did it mean? Was she destined to be a widow and childless? Thinking of this, she couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. Was she really a bad omen? Why did the Empress Dowager marry her off to her own son? Did she want Edward Harrington dead? Silently walking up to Edward Harrington, he glanced at her coldly, saw the clear handprint on her cheek, his eyes flashed, his lips moved slightly, but in the end, he didn't say anything, turned around, and strode out of the palace. She quietly followed. In a daze, she felt that the man in front of her and she were the same kind of people, both using a strong exterior to hide the pain in their hearts. Has she made any moves? In the study, Edward Harrington asked, his face cold and expressionless. "Your Highness, in the past 2 months, the princess has not stepped out of Falling Lotus Pavilion. Every day she stays in her room to rest, or goes out to the courtyard to enjoy the cool air. She has always been very quiet." Guard Henry Fletcher reported the results of the 2-month surveillance to the prince. "Have you got the results of your investigation?" "Yes, I have." Henry Fletcher replied, but didn't know how to say it. "Speak." Edward Harrington glanced at him and said. "Yes. According to the investigation, the reason why the Empress Dowager married the princess to your highness is because..." Henry Fletcher stealthily observed his master, seemingly afraid to speak. After receiving his master's cold and impatient gaze, he finally took the plunge, suddenly knelt on the ground, and said in one breath, "It's because the princess was born in the Een hour, Een month, Een year, she is the heaven star of misfortune, cursed to kill husband and sons." Edward Harrington was momentarily stunned, his dark eyes flashed with anger, his face as calm as the surface of a lake before a storm. His fists clenched, his knuckles white. Below, Henry Fletcher bowed his head and knelt on the ground, drenched in cold sweat. "Leave." After a long time, Edward Harrington coldly uttered 2 words. His cold voice couldn't hide his fury. "Yes." Henry Fletcher replied. "No need to follow her anymore." "Yes." After Henry Fletcher withdrew, he was the only one left in the large study. He raised his hand and slammed it down on the table in front of him. Crash! The large rosewood table shattered into pieces. And Edward Harrington was full of anger, his body radiating a murderous aura, trembling with rage. Why? why do you want to push me to my death? And find a woman to kill me? I am your own son, why do you treat me like this? I have never believed in fate, alright, I want to see if that woman can kill me. Mother, watch carefully. Miss, you've been married here for more than 2 months, but apart from the wedding night, His Highness has never been to Falling Lotus Pavilion. What should we do? At noon, Margaret Harrington was lying on the chaise lounge in the courtyard enjoying the cool air. Lillian Moore couldn't help but say. She was worried about her mistress. Why did her mistress seem not to care at all? The emperor is not in a hurry, but the eunuch is. Hashtag chapter 21, Fortune telling to save a life. Lillian Moore, you've said these words countless times, can we change the subject? Unable to bear the incessant chatter, Margaret Harrington finally spoke in exasperation. She realized this girl wasn't just an ordinary chatterbox, she could rival the most gossipy of aunts. But because Lillian was naive, guileless, and genuinely cared for her, Margaret tolerated her. She let Lillian chatter as much as she wanted, tuning it out as if she heard nothing. Miss, why aren't you the least bit anxious? Lillian Moore was so worried she nearly jumped out of her skin. Being anxious is useless. His legs are on his body, not mine. What can I do? Margaret Harrington said calmly. She only hoped he wouldn't come. From the moment she opened her eyes after being reborn, she had decided to forsake romantic love in this life. Marrying Edward Harrington was only to seek refuge and live a peaceful life. Therefore, she wouldn't try to win his favor. Miss, you don't know how arrogant and haughty the prince's concubines are. They completely disregard you, the princess, and constantly talk behind your back, Lillian Moore said indignantly. Let them talk. It doesn't take a piece of flesh off me, Margaret Harrington replied. Those women were merely victims of the feudal patriarchal system, vying for the affection of one man, fighting amongst themselves, truly pitiful. As long as they didn't provoke her, she wouldn't bother with them. Oh, miss. Lillian Moore fell silent. She had thought her mistress had become stronger. It turned out nothing had changed, she was still as timid and weak as before. How could Miss possibly stand firm in the prince's household like this? Lillian Moore, tomorrow we'll go to the temple for a few days. Make some preparations. She knew that being cooped up for over 2 months must have bored Lillian Moore, and she herself was a little tired. So, it would be good to go out and relax. And incidentally, investigate the reason behind that Jinx, husband killer, label. Moreover, she noticed that the person Edward Harrington had sent to monitor her had withdrawn, and she felt a flicker of joy. After all, being watched day in and day out wasn't pleasant. It seemed there was something between the Empress Dowager and Edward Harrington that they didn't want others to know, and Edward Harrington suspected she was a spy sent by the Empress Dowager. But she didn't care about the truth, she just wanted to live her peaceful life. Really? Does Miss want to go to the temple to pray for blessings for the prince? Lillian Moore exclaimed joyfully. Yes, Margaret Harrington replied absently. Pray for blessings for Edward Harrington? Only the silly girl Lillian Moore would think that. Arriving at a bustling temple outside Diddy City, Margaret Harrington sincerely bowed before the Bodhisattva, then sought out an old monk for a fortune-telling. In truth, she didn't believe in the Bodhisattva at all, relying on oneself was better than relying on others, that was her creed. But the ancients strongly believed in fate, so she wanted to give it a try and see if she truly carried the fate of a Jinx, husband killer. Unexpectedly, the old monk stared at her for a long time, as if looking at a rare animal, until her scalp tingled. Finally, he clasped his hands and said, Amipa, your fate has changed. This humble monk cannot read it. What did it mean that her fate had changed? She looked at the old monk before her and said coldly, I've heard you're an enlightened monk. Can you truly not read my fate? You overpraise me. You are a dragon among men, a phoenix among women, not an ordinary mortal. I truly cannot fathom your destiny. The old monk replied, his hands clasped together. Are you deceiving me, master? Margaret Harrington said coldly. Why do some say I'm cursed, bringing misfortune to my husband and causing death? Do you not know this? Amidst. You did indeed carry such a fate before, but this body is not that body, this soul is not that soul. Naturally, your destiny has changed. The old monk spoke slowly. Margaret Harrington's entire body trembled. Astonished, she asked, You know where I come from? The old monk shook his head, replying, That is a heavenly secret I am not fated to know. I pray you perform many good deeds in the future, for good deeds will surely bring blessings. This place was truly tranquil. Living here brought peace of mind, even allowing Charles Stone, a constant worry in her heart, to be released. At noon, Margaret Harrington strolled alone through the woods behind the temple, feeling the vibrant life and serenity of nature. She pondered the old monk's words, this body is not that body, this soul is not that soul. It seemed there truly were mysterious, inexplicable things in this world, at least inexplicable by 21st century science. Recalling the monk's advice to do good deeds and receive blessings, she couldn't help but take a deep breath. She knew how to be virtuous, but she didn't seek blessings, only peace of mind. Wandering aimlessly for a while, she suddenly noticed bloodstains on the ground. How strange. This was sacred ground, why was there fresh blood? Following the trail, she discovered a man lying motionless beneath a tree, covered in blood. Approaching for a closer look, she saw a man in his 50s, with dignified, even strikingly handsome features, though he was getting on in years. Checking his breath, she found him still faintly breathing, not yet dead. She didn't want to involve herself in trouble, but the thought of doing a good deed changed her mind. With great effort, she carried the unconscious man back to her temporary lodgings. She fetched clean water, washed his wounds, and then sent Lillian Moore to ask the abbot for some medicinal herbs. She applied them to his wounds and carefully bandaged them. The man's bones were unbroken, he simply had multiple sword wounds and had lost a lot of blood. It seemed he, like her in her past life, was someone who lived by the sword. 2 days later, as Margaret Harrington sat reading, the unconscious man on the bed suddenly awoke. He opened his eyes, looking around in confusion. Where was this? You've been unconscious for 2 days. Now that you're awake, leave. Margaret Harrington, reclining on a chaise lounge, heard the noise, glanced at him, and spoke indifferently. The cool female voice startled the man. He turned his head towards Margaret Harrington. In that instant, his eyes widened, a torrent of emotions, pain, grief, excitement, joy, disbelief, washed over him. Not far from the bed, a breathtakingly beautiful woman reclined lazily on a chaise lounge, her eyes half closed like a sleepy cat. Her small, fair face was devoid of makeup, yet she was as captivating as a hibiscus flower. Delicate willow-leaf eyebrows framed alluring, narrow phoenix eyes, a small, straight nose, and luscious cherry lips. Her long black hair was loosely tied with a jade hairpin, a few strands falling around her face, adding to her languid air. Though dressed simply, she looked like a celestial being descended from the heavens. More importantly, she greatly resembled the beloved he had sought for nearly 20 years. Rose. Rose. Is that you? He stammered, his voice deep with affection and sorrow. Margaret Harrington looked at him, puzzled, but when she saw his sorrowful, melancholic eyes filled with hope, she froze. Her brows furrowed. Why did this man seem to know her? The man stumbled out of bed, came before her, grasped her shoulders, and trembled as he asked, Rose, is it really you? Is it truly you? I've finally found you. Do you know I've searched for you for 20 years? Today, I've finally found you. Rose, don't leave me again, never leave me again. He spoke excitedly, then embraced Margaret Harrington tightly, as if afraid she would disappear. Margaret Harrington wanted to roll her eyes. Searched for her for 20 years. This young lady is only 16 years old, all right. Margaret Harrington calmly pushed him away, coldly saying, "You've mistaken me for someone else. I'm not Rose. Furthermore, I'm only 16 years old." The man visibly trembled, staring into her cold eyes, and a deep disappointment and sorrow gradually welled up within them. The young woman before him wasn't her. Indeed, Rose would be nearly 40 years old now. How could she still look like she did back then? His Rose was lost forever. Dejected, he retreated to the bedside and sat down without a word. Seeing the sorrow in his eyes, Margaret Harrington felt a pang of sympathy. It seemed he was a man wounded by love. She, too, had experienced this kind of bone-deep yearning. She said nothing, reclining back on the chaise lounge and picking up a book to read. One room, one man grieving, one woman reading, the scene was somewhat bizarre. At least, it was in Lillian Moore's eyes. Lillian Moore entered with medicine and found the scene strange. She glanced at the man by the bed and softly called, "Mississippi." "Put it on the table," Margaret Harrington instructed calmly, without looking up. "Yes, Mississippi." Lillian Moore obediently placed the medicine on the table and returned to stand beside Margaret Harrington. "You should take your medicine," Margaret Harrington said coldly, looking at the man sitting dazedly on the bed. Hearing her voice, the man suddenly looked up and stared at her. This action startled Lillian Moore, but the young lady remained calm, her expression unchanged, still as cold as ever. The man stared at her for a long while, then suddenly said, "Do you know Rose Harrington? You look just like her." Margaret Harrington frowned. But Lillian Moore beside her exclaimed, "Rose Harrington? Miss, isn't that your mother?" As soon as she finished speaking, the other two looked at her. Lillian Moore was a little frightened, but when she saw her mistress's questioning gaze, she stammered, "Miss, you may have forgotten, your mother's maiden name was Rose Harrington. You're Rose's daughter." The man stared at her, his deep eyes unreadable, filled with both joy and disappointment. He was overjoyed to finally have news of the woman he loved, but the fact that she had a daughter this old was something he couldn't immediately accept. Margaret Harrington replied casually. She couldn't deny it, the truth was right in front of her. Otherwise, why would he have mistaken her? "So where is my wife now? Is she living well?" the man asked excitedly. "My mother, she's passed away." Facing such a lovesick man, Margaret Harrington suddenly found it difficult to tell the truth. But she had to. Passed away? How could this be? He cried out in astonishment, unable to believe what he had just heard. "She died during childbirth," Margaret Harrington said indifferently. "It had nothing to do with her, she wasn't even her biological child." But saying these words, she felt a pang of guilt. How strange. Since when had her heart become so soft? "Childbirth," he murmured. "No wonder I couldn't find her. So she's no longer in this world." His eyes grew dim, as if he had aged a decade. Margaret Harrington couldn't bear to see him like this, it reminded her of how much she had yearned for Charles Stone. She said, "She's gone, don't grieve anymore. If my mother has a spirit, she would surely want you to live happily. I won't bother you any longer. Rest, and drink your medicine while it's still warm." She pushed the door open and went out, Lillian Moore following behind. "Miss, who was that? Why was he asking about Madam?" Lillian Moore couldn't help but ask curiously. "A heartbroken man," Margaret Harrington murmured, gazing into the distance. "Who?" Lillian Moore didn't hear clearly and asked again. "Don't ask if you shouldn't ask, don't speak if you shouldn't speak." Margaret Harrington snapped, her voice cold. "Yes, miss," Lillian Moore pouted and replied, feeling wronged. Margaret Harrington shook her head helplessly. This girl was so naive. In the late afternoon, Margaret Harrington saw the man sitting alone in the woods, lost in thought. She walked over and sat down beside him. The man, seeing the girl beside him with a face resembling his beloved, was stunned. "Can you tell me your story?" Margaret Harrington asked coldly. The man's eyes darkened, and he said nothing. His gaze drifted into the distance, as if seeing events long past. Margaret Harrington didn't press him further, just sat quietly. After a long while, the man finally spoke, breaking the silence. His voice, filled with melancholy, drifted through the air like a thin wisp of smoke. "My name is Victor Blackwell, and I was Rose's childhood sweetheart. Back then, she was a sheltered young lady, and I was just the steward's son. Rose was incredibly beautiful and had a lovely personality. We grew up together, happy in each other's company, and deeply in love. When Rose was 16, I went to her father to ask for her hand in marriage. I was devastated. That night, I snuck into the Stone estate, intending to elope with Rose. But we didn't escape. Her father caught us and beat me nearly to death. Rose wept and pleaded for me, promising never to see me again. Only then was I spared." Remembering the past, he closed his eyes, as if enduring the pain in his heart. Margaret Harrington could picture the scene of their separation years ago. Chapter 22, The Whip's Punishment. Back then, I swore I'd live a worthy life, return to Rose, and care for her always. I went to Heavenly Mount, mastered my teacher's skills in 3 years. But upon reaching the Stone estate, I learned her family had fallen into ruin 2 years prior. Rose's heartless father sold her to a brothel. I frantically searched every brothel, but the Windcloud Empire is vast, the brothels countless. How could I ever find her? So, I joined the Shadow Gang. A feared assassin organization, they possess the most extensive intelligence network. Nothing in the Windcloud Empire escapes their notice. I hoped they could find Rose. But I was a nobody. The Shadow Gang wouldn't mobilize for me. So, I climbed the ranks. Years later, I became their leader. Margaret Harrington wasn't surprised. She'd sensed he was no ordinary man, likely a swordsman. The killing aura, even in his coma, hinted at his extraordinary nature. Indeed, he led a world-renowned assassin organization. I used all resources to find Rose. But she vanished. 20 years, and nothing. I never imagined she, Victor Blackwell, choked up. Margaret Harrington's heart ached. She could imagine his sacrifice for love. Mother was fortunate to have a man so devoted, she murmured. Victor Blackwell turned to the girl beside him, Rose's spitting image. I promised Rose I'd care for her always. Now that she's gone, let me care for her daughter, all right? Margaret Harrington froze, looking at him quizzically. Don't misunderstand, he explained. I mean, you could be my adopted daughter. Let me care for you in Rose's place. Margaret Harrington was silent. She remembered her adoptive father from her Phantom Wraith days. He took her from the streets, trained her as a cold-blooded killer, and pushed her into an abyss. She wanted no more adoptive fathers, no connections to assassins. But looking at his hopeful eyes, she couldn't refuse. They were both lost in a foreign land, both wounded by love. Seeing his eyes dim, she called out, "Adoptive father." Victor Blackwell's eyes lit up, a tremor in his voice. Yes, yes. Margaret Harrington smiled, her first genuine smile in this strange world. It radiated from within, a dazzling, gentle light. She knew this man wouldn't harm her. She knew in this strange place, she had family, someone who truly cared, offering paternal warmth. Victor Blackwell smiled, content. He saw Rose smiling happily. 3 days later, Margaret Harrington and Lillian Moore left the nunnery. Victor Blackwell gave her a token, telling her to seek him if she faced trouble. Traitors within the Shadow Gang nearly cost him his life. He had to return and cleanse the organization. Entering the royal mansion, she encountered gaudily dressed women, Edward Harrington's concubines. Margaret Harrington ignored them, but they wouldn't let her be. These women seethed with pent-up frustration. Finally, they had the culprit within reach. They all craved the position of royal consort, yet this useless girl held it. How could they not be furious? She'd been hiding in Falling Lotus Pavilion. They feared angering the prince, so they hadn't dared confront her openly. Today's opportunity was too good to miss. The prince didn't favor her, he'd only visited her on their wedding night. He was at court and wouldn't help her. Well, isn't it our dear royal consort? The sun rises in the west today, bringing you out, Isabella Brooks, the most favored, sneered. Margaret Harrington glanced coldly at her, recognizing the pink-clad woman from breakfast. Undeniably beautiful, her arrogance, fueled by favor, was repulsive. Margaret Harrington lowered her head, wanting to pass. She wouldn't waste time on these mad women. Oh, royal consort, don't rush off. Another woman blocked her path. Immediately, they surrounded her and Lillian Moore. They believed the rumors of her timid nature, emboldening their bullying. Margaret Harrington lowered her head, her eyes icy. Royal consort, that hairpin is lovely. A gift from the prince, one sneered, eyeing her gold jewelry. How could it be? Don't forget, our royal consort is the daughter of the Windcloud Empire's richest family. Indeed, another chimed in. But the daughter of the Harrington, the richest family, is said to be beautiful and virtuous. Our royal consort doesn't resemble that at all. Do you think there's been a mistake? Our royal consort isn't actually the Harrington's daughter. How could Charles Harrington have such an ugly and stupid daughter? Another finished, and they burst into laughter. Margaret Harrington remained still, her expression unchanged. Lillian Moore's face flushed with anger. You're talking nonsense. Our lady is the master's true daughter. Don't slander her. A servant speaks out of turn. It seems a useless mistress has a foolish servant. Isabella Brooks mocked. Margaret Harrington couldn't believe Isabella Brooks, a stunning beauty, was so mindless. Her petty squabbles wouldn't end well. Such a fool. You're the useless ones. You're the fools. Lillian Moore yelled. Lillian Moore. Margaret Harrington intervened, but it was too late. Trouble was brewing. Insolent slave. Isabella Brooks shrieked, slapping Lillian Moore. Lillian Moore retaliated, grabbing Isabella Brooks's hand and shoving her to the ground. Rebellion. Rebellion. Isabella Brooks wailed. What's going on? The women were about to attack Margaret Harrington and Lillian Moore when a cold, authoritative voice cut through the crowd. They turned to see Edward Harrington, his face like ice, standing behind them with Henry Fletcher, his guard. He'd just entered the mansion. The vicious women transformed into meek lambs, curtsying. Your Highness. Isabella Brooks rushed to Edward Harrington's side, clinging to him. Your Highness, the royal consort's maid bullied me. She pushed me to the ground. You must avenge me. Is that so? Edward Harrington glanced at Margaret Harrington, her hair full of hairpins, disgust and anger flashing in his eyes. This woman, chosen by his mother, was his curse. Forgive me, Your Highness. Lillian Moore knelt, trembling. They were saying the royal consort is. Your Highness, I failed to discipline my servant. I beg your forgiveness. Margaret Harrington knelt, cutting off Lillian Moore, her cold voice stunning everyone. Oh. Edward Harrington was slightly surprised, this timid woman dared to defend her maid. Your Highness, you must do me justice, Isabella Brooks purred, her small, white hand stroking Edward Harrington's chest. For the maid's insolence, drag her down and give her 30 lashes. Edward Harrington said coldly. Lillian Moore's face paled. 30 lashes, how could she survive? Margaret Harrington's face darkened. Your Highness, it's my fault for not properly disciplining her. I beg your forgiveness, I'll bear all the consequences. Everyone was astonished, they didn't expect her to say that. Even Edward Harrington was a little surprised. Sister Margaret, don't you know, servants are punished with lashes, but mistresses are punished with the rod? How could your delicate body endure that? Besides, she's just a lowly maid, why should you bother? Isabella Brooks said sweetly, but a malicious glint flashed in her eyes. Hearing Isabella Brooks's sarcastic tone, Margaret Harrington felt disgusted, but she still bowed her head and said firmly, I'm willing to take the punishment in her place. Since it was her fault, she wouldn't let someone else suffer for her. Edward Harrington raised an eyebrow, surprised by her reaction. She dared to take the punishment for her maid. The other women were also surprised. Miss Lillian Moore cried out, tears welling up. She sobbed, Miss Lillian Moore is at fault, I'm willing to accept the punishment, I won't implicate you. Margaret Harrington glanced at her indifferently, then turned to Edward Harrington and said, I'm willing to accept the punishment. Edward Harrington looked at the woman bowing her head in surprise. He really wanted to see if she was truly this good to her maid, or if she was trying to get his attention. So, he said, since the princess consort wants to take the punishment for her, I shall grant your wish. Someone, drag the princess consort down and give her 30 strokes of the rod. Your Highness, please spare the princess consort, I'm willing to accept the punishment myself. Please, Your Highness, please, Lillian Moore cried out in terror. The rod was the most brutal punishment in the manor, reserved only for those who committed heinous crimes. How could the princess consort's frail body endure it? Not to mention 30 strokes, even one would be enough to kill her. But no one paid attention to her pleas. The other women only wished Margaret Harrington would die. That way, they would have a chance to become the princess consort. So, at this moment, everyone was gloating. The rod punishment was carried out by the manor guards. They were all strong men, showing no mercy, each stroke tearing flesh and skin. Because it was so brutal, this punishment was rarely used on women, but unexpectedly, it was now being used on the mistress of the manor. Begin. Edward Harrington sat to the side and ordered, his tone as indifferent as if he were talking about the weather. The other women standing behind him didn't dare to speak. Lillian Moore knelt to the side, trembling. Margaret Harrington lay prone on the long chair in the middle of the courtyard, her face still indifferent and expressionless, but inwardly cursing this prince for actually sitting and watching. Did he find this amusing? As you command, Your Highness. The guard carried out the order, swinging the long, black rod in his hand, the whistling wind terrifying. Crack! A sharp sound rang out as the rod landed heavily on Margaret Harrington's back, tearing her clothes, and her jade-like white skin was instantly covered in blood. Many timid women turned their faces away in fear, not daring to look. But Margaret Harrington didn't even frown. Edward Harrington raised an eyebrow, quite surprised. How could this timid woman endure the beating so well? Crack! Another stroke landed, tearing another bloody wound on Margaret Harrington's back, but she still didn't react, her downcast eyes remaining as cold as ever. Crack, crack, the rod fell, the guard showing no mercy. The burning pain on her back made Margaret Harrington's vision blur. In her days, she remembered when she was Phantom Wraith, telling her adoptive father that she didn't want to be Phantom Wraith anymore, she just wanted to be Charles Stone's bride, Lil Grace. At that time, her adoptive father was furious, hanging her in the secret chamber, whipping her with a leather whip, wanting her to change her mind. The whip fell, each lash tearing her skin and flesh, but she gritted her teeth, refusing to yield. After torturing her for 3 days and 3 nights, her adoptive father finally relented, agreeing that as long as she completed the final mission, he would grant her wish, let her leave the organization, and be with Charles Stone. She remembered clearly, at that time. Although she had been beaten to a pulp, she was truly happy, so happy that she no longer felt the pain on her back. Because she could finally pursue her love. But now, where was her love? Where was her Charles Stone? Everything was gone. But who could she blame? Blame Charles Stone? No. He was only avenging his father, there was nothing wrong with that. But why did he use her feelings to hurt her? It was more painful than being cut by a knife. Having been an assassin, was she destined to live in hell forever? Chapter 23, the second entry to the palace. 30 lashes landed, leaving Margaret Harrington's back a mangled mess of flesh and blood. Timid women averted their gaze, but a few malicious ones, like Isabella Brooks, watched with glee. Edward Harrington remained seated, his expression impassive, observing the woman prone on the chaise lounge, his gaze unreadable. Is she dead? Why is she so still? If the women in the palace knew I'd flogged the heaven star of misfortune, their mistress had painstakingly sought, I wonder what they'd think. Lillian Moore rushed forward, weeping, crying, Miss, what's wrong, don't frighten me. Seeing Margaret Harrington's closed eyes, she thought she was dead. Unexpectedly, Margaret Harrington opened her eyes, her gaze as calm as ever. She rose with difficulty from the chaise lounge, turned to Edward Harrington, and said coldly, Your Highness, I have received my punishment. I'll take my leave. With that, she bowed slightly and, her blood-soaked body dragging, returned to Falling Lotus Pavilion. She seemed oblivious to the astonishment on the faces of Edward Harrington and the others. Lillian Moore stood stunned for a moment, only snapping out of it when Margaret Harrington was further away. She scrambled up, calling, Miss, wait for me. And dashed after her like an arrow. Edward Harrington watched the woman, her back lacerated but her demeanor composed, a complex look flickering in his dark eyes. Night fell. Inside the study. Does that woman know martial arts? Edward Harrington asked in a low voice. All day, he couldn't shake the image of her enduring the flogging. That kind of punishment would make even a strong man scream in agony, yet she hadn't uttered a single sound. From beginning to end, she remained calm, as if the person being beaten wasn't her, but someone insignificant. But the lashes had indeed landed on her flesh, tearing her skin open. Why was she like this? She didn't seem like the timid, fragile woman he'd perceived. Had he missed something? Unbeknownst to him, having undergone brutal assassin training since childhood, Margaret Harrington had cultivated exceptional self-control and endurance. This kind of flogging was child's play to her. She had endured punishments 100 times more cruel. Your Highness, according to our investigation, the princess consort was always neglected at the Harrington estate. Bullied from a young age, timid and frail, she never left the estate, never learned martial arts, and never even learned to read or write. Henry Fletcher replied respectfully. Witnessing today's events, he too was shaken, lost in thought. This princess consort didn't seem timid or frail at all. Could it be that she was so used to being beaten from a young age that this kind of punishment was nothing to her? Edward Harrington frowned. This explanation made no sense. Enough. She was just an insignificant woman, not worth his concern. Yet, why did he feel a flicker of unease? Henry Fletcher, take the soothing jade dew balm from my chambers and give it to her, Edward Harrington finally said. Henry Fletcher was taken aback, then replied, Yes, Your Highness. This soothing jade dew balm was a legendary healing salve, a tribute from the western regions. Even the prince usually wouldn't use it, yet he was giving it to her. Late at night, Margaret Harrington, unable to sleep, slipped away from Lillian Moore and sat alone in the courtyard, gazing at the moon. The wound on my back, though treated, still burned with a fierce, throbbing ache. Lillian Moore has wept ceaselessly since our return, consumed by self-reproach. But it wasn't her fault. Those women, seeking a quarrel, dared not touch me, so they vented their spite on her. I don't wish to contend with them, I only desire a tranquil life of my own. She accepted her subservient role, enduring the abuse within the household, hoping only for brief moments of peace. She knew following a master like me was a misfortune, so taking Lillian Moore's punishment was a way to atone. The whip sting was superficial, a mere flesh wound. It couldn't compare to the torment that gnawed at my heart. Charles Stone, do you hate me so much? You wouldn't even hear me out, just killed me. I still vividly remember the moment your sword pierced my chest, shattering my heart into fragments. My heart still aches so much. Gazing at the moon above, I can't help but wonder what you're doing now, if you ever think of me. A bitter laugh escapes my lips at the thought. You approached me only to kill me, how could you possibly remember me? Yet, I foolishly immersed myself, lost in your warm, sun-like smile, unable to break free. Even though you killed me, I bear no resentment, only longing and affection. I truly am beyond redemption. A slight noise nearby caught my attention. My heart clenched. Someone was coming. Who's there? Show yourself. I spoke coldly, my gaze icy. As expected, a tall figure emerged from the shadows. Facing me, he spoke with equal coldness, Your Highness has keen hearing. Margaret Harrington gave him a cold glance, offering no reply. She knew him as Edward Harrington's personal guard, as cold and stern as his master. What is it? She asked icily. Henry Fletcher was startled by her composure. This woman, he realized that he and the king understood nothing about her. Is your highness yearning for someone? He couldn't help but ask. He had seen the melancholy and loneliness in her eyes as she gazed at the moon, a sight that stirred even his icy heart. None of your concern. Her tone remained frigid. Her gaze remained fixed on the moon, as if he didn't exist. Henry Fletcher observed her for a moment, then conceded. I come bearing medicine from His Majesty, specifically for your highness. He placed a jar of jade balm on the stone table in the courtyard. Seeing no reaction from Margaret Harrington, he continued, the Mid-Autumn Festival is in 3 days. His Majesty instructs you to recover well and join him at the palace for the festivities. I shall take my leave. Wait. He had taken only 2 steps when she called out. He stopped but didn't turn. I desire only a peaceful life, free from power struggles. I wish to do nothing that would harm His Majesty. You are constantly by his side, I hope you understand this, she said coldly. Henry Fletcher froze. A clever man, he instantly grasped her meaning. She hoped he wouldn't tell the prince what he'd seen tonight, she simply wanted to be ordinary, to let everyone believe the prince's wife was a timid, frail woman. She truly wasn't a simple woman. How could he have misjudged her before, thinking she was nothing more than a timid, frail woman? He said coldly, this subordinate understands. It's just that the night wind is strong, and the princess is injured. It's best she not stay outside too long. Having said that, he quickly departed. She naturally understood his implication. If she wanted to feign ordinariness, she should obediently stay in bed and recover, not sit alone in the garden late at night. Such behavior would arouse suspicion. Margaret Harrington gazed at the small, exquisite porcelain jar on the stone table and couldn't help but sigh. She only wanted a peaceful life, so why was it so difficult? 3 days later, Margaret Harrington and Edward Harrington once again entered the palace. She still wore gaudy makeup and a head full of messy gold jewelry, unbearably vulgar. Edward Harrington glanced at her with disgust, then ignored her. It seemed the guard hadn't said much. This was precisely what she wanted. Today was the Mid-Autumn Festival, a significant day of reunion in the Windcloud Empire. During the day, the emperor would hold a grand banquet for his officials. All nobles and officials were required to bring their families. In the evening, after the banquet, everyone would return home to celebrate with their families under the moon. When they arrived, the banquet hadn't yet begun, but many people were already seated in the main hall. Seeing them arrive, the civil and military officials bowed, we greet the prince and princess. Rise, Edward Harrington said sternly, then proceeded to his seat. Margaret Harrington followed. The officials and their families attending the banquet stealthily glanced their way, whispering and casting contemptuous looks at Margaret Harrington. She pretended not to notice, sitting quietly. Edward Harrington, however, was different. Seeing everyone staring and whispering about him, his face grew increasingly gloomy. Although he didn't care about reputation, he couldn't stand being gossiped about right in front of him. So he glared at Margaret Harrington, then stood up and left, seemingly unwilling to sit with her. He was likely going to find his imperial brother. Margaret Harrington sighed inwardly. How could she be blamed for this? It was those gossiping busybodies who couldn't mind their own business. Whether she was beautiful or ugly, what did it have to do with them? A moment later, Margaret Harrington, truly unable to bear their stares, left the main hall and strolled into the Imperial Garden. The Autumn Imperial Garden was a kingdom of chrysanthemums. Red, yellow, white, pink, in clusters and clumps, they vied for attention. She deeply appreciated the noble character of chrysanthemums, while other flowers bloomed profusely in spring and summer, they waited patiently. When other flowers withered, they stood proudly against the frost, bringing a touch of brilliance to the fading autumn. In this life, she wanted to be a chrysanthemum, uncompetitive, indifferent to the gazes of others, simply elegant. Surely, one day, she too, like the chrysanthemum, would welcome her own season of bloom. Strolling and admiring the flowers, she arrived at the lakeside. It was a small lake in the garden, its water crystal clear, shimmering under the sunlight. Looking at the tranquil surface of the lake, her heart found peace. Glancing upwards, she saw a procession slowly advancing towards her. Leading the group were James Harrington and Edward Harrington, followed by the dignified Queen and several richly dressed women, presumably the Emperor's concubines, trailed by a throng of palace maids and eunuchs. Edward Harrington and James Harrington were conversing about something, their usually impassive faces softened by faint smiles. She couldn't believe those icebergs could actually smile, it was like the sun rising in the west. Margaret Harrington turned to leave. Just then, frantic cries erupted from the lakeside. Help! Help! The Crown Prince and Princess have fallen in the water. Save them! The Crown Prince and Princess have fallen in the water. The Crown Prince has fallen in the water. The eunuchs and maids' panicked screams echoed throughout the imperial gardens. Margaret Harrington looked out at the lake. She saw a small, ornate boat drifting in the middle, empty. Two small ripples disturbed the water's surface near the boat. Two children were struggling. Every second counted. Without hesitation, Margaret Harrington plunged into the water with a splash. Immediately after Margaret Harrington jumped, two more splashes followed as the two men leaped in after her. 3 wakes sliced through the lake's surface, converging towards the center. Leading the way was a petite woman, swimming with remarkable speed. Like an arrow loosed from a bow, she rapidly closed the distance to the center of the lake, leaving the two men far behind. In her past life, during her godfather's swimming lessons, crocodiles were often released behind them. Survival depended on outswimming the predators, otherwise, they became a meal. This brutal training had instilled in Margaret Harrington a lightning-fast swimming speed, born of a desperate fight for survival. Although this body was weaker than her previous one, and the wound on her back reopened with a searing pain, slowing her down considerably, she was still much faster than the Harrington brothers. By the time Margaret Harrington reached the center of the lake, both children had sunk beneath the surface. Margaret Harrington dove down, grabbing a small girl. Unable to rescue both children at once, she surfaced, pulling the unconscious child towards the shore. Halfway to the shore, she encountered the two brothers underwater. She pushed the child towards them, simply saying, "Take her to the shore," before turning back to the center of the lake. Edward Harrington and James Harrington were stunned, but this was no time for surprise. Edward Harrington looked at his brother, then pulled the unconscious girl towards the shore. James Harrington continued swimming towards the center of the lake. When Margaret Harrington returned, the child was no longer visible on the surface. She took a deep breath and dove down. Fortunately, the lake water was crystal clear, and Margaret Harrington quickly located the boy. She swam to him and pulled him to the surface. Just then, the Emperor arrived. Slightly exhausted, Margaret Harrington glanced at him before they both pulled the child towards the shore. Everyone on the shore breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Queen had already summoned the imperial physician, and the little princess was receiving emergency treatment. Fortunately, she hadn't been submerged for long and was still breathing, her life not in danger. After being stabilized, she was taken back to the palace. Watching the woman and his brother pull the child to shore, their actions seeming intimate, Edward Harrington felt a pang of inexplicable annoyance. Margaret Harrington and James Harrington swam ashore. Edward Harrington immediately took the child and carried it aside for emergency care. James Harrington jumped ashore, about to check on the child, turned around and saw Margaret Harrington leaning against the bank, panting. He immediately extended his hand and said, "Give me your hand, I'll pull you up." He didn't realize he had said, "I," instead of, "we." Chapter 24, Artificial Respiration. Margaret Harrington heard the voice, looked up and saw it was the Emperor, didn't think much of it, thanked him, and gave him her hand to be pulled ashore. This scene happened to catch the eye of Edward Harrington, who was looking in this direction, and a look of displeasure immediately appeared on his handsome face. After coming ashore, the Emperor went to check on the child, while Margaret Harrington sat on the grass by the bank, catching her breath. Good heavens, she hadn't trained much since her rebirth, and she didn't expect her body to be so weak that she couldn't get up after just a short swim. It seems that she can't neglect her training in the future. Having martial arts skills will allow her to protect herself and respond to any unexpected situations. Otherwise, she will really become a fish on a chopping board, at the mercy of others. The royal physician checked the boy's breathing, his face immediately turning pale. "What's wrong with Lance?" the Empress asked anxiously. "What's wrong with the Crown Prince?" James Harrington's face darkened as he asked sternly, his eyes filled with worry. Your Majesty, the Crown Prince, has stopped breathing." The old royal physician knelt on the ground, trembling as he replied. The concubines, eunuchs, and palace maids around them also knelt down. "Impossible, impossible. My Lance won't die," the usually gentle Empress cried out in agitation. She rushed forward and hugged the boy, weeping, "Lance, wake up, your mother is here. Wake up, don't leave your mother." James Harrington's face was grim, and he stood motionless as a mountain. Edward Harrington stepped forward to check the boy's breathing, then shook his head helplessly at James Harrington. Hearing the commotion, Margaret Harrington knew something had happened. She stood up, pushed through the crowd, and stepped inside. Seeing the Empress holding the boy and crying, Margaret Harrington frowned and said coldly, "Give me the child." Everyone was stunned, unsure of what she intended to do. The Empress looked at her blankly, still holding her son, without making any move. "Give him to me if you don't want him to die." Margaret Harrington, also anxious, snapped coldly, then snatched the child from the stunned Empress. She laid him flat on the grass. Checking his breathing, she confirmed that he had indeed stopped breathing. Fortunately, it hadn't been long, and he could still be saved. She quickly unbuttoned the boy's collar, opened his mouth, and ensured his airway was clear. Then she bent down and breathed into his body. The surrounding people stared blankly at her performing artificial respiration, their eyes wide, forgetting to react. After a while of artificial respiration, Margaret Harrington placed her hands on top of each other and pressed on the boy's chest, then continued with artificial respiration after a short time. Repeating this process, about 20 minutes later, the boy coughed up a mouthful of water and his breathing returned. Margaret Harrington breathed a sigh of relief, stroking the boy's chest and saying, "As long as you can breathe, you're not dead. You little rascal, you've got a strong life force." A comforting smile involuntarily spread across her face. Margaret Harrington adored children for their innocent purity and genuine smiles. Only in their presence did her own sweet smile grace her lips. Submerged for so long, Margaret Harrington's makeup washed away, revealing her smooth, porcelain skin. She possessed an exquisite beauty, delicate willow-leaf eyebrows like a crescent moon, luscious cherry lips that captivated the soul, clear, intelligent eyes, and a small, rosy face as refreshing as a spring breeze, as pure as a lotus flower. Her hair ornaments lay lost in the water, her long, soft black hair cascading down to her waist. She appeared as a celestial being descended from the heavens. Her ethereal beauty, already otherworldly, made it difficult to look directly at her. Now, with a gentle smile, she resembled a blossoming spring flower, incomparably beautiful. Thump. Edward Harrington felt a sharp blow to his heart, momentarily forgetting to breathe. The others were similarly affected. The emperor, empress, officials, concubines, court ladies, and eunuchs, all stood mesmerized by this celestial being gracing the mortal realm. The boy coughed a few times, gradually regaining consciousness. Overjoyed, Margaret Harrington looked up at the emperor, only to realize everyone was staring at her. She touched her face in bewilderment, discovering her smooth skin, devoid of any makeup. Her expression turned icy. "The child is awake," she stated coldly. As if awakened from a dream, everyone stirred. James Harrington coughed awkwardly, Edward Harrington averted his gaze, and the others hastily lowered their heads. Queen Victoria rushed forward, embracing the crown prince, crying out joyfully, "Lance, Lance." Margaret Harrington stood and stepped aside. Her wet clothes clung to her body, revealing her curves as she rose, accentuating her breathtaking beauty and igniting imaginations. Stealthy glances followed her every move. Edward Harrington's face darkened with displeasure, as if something precious had been taken from him. His sharp gaze swept across the crowd, sending shivers down their spines as they quickly lowered their heads in fear. Seemingly oblivious, Margaret Harrington lowered her head and stepped aside, her demeanor once again timid and apprehensive. As Edward Harrington moved to embrace her, a court lady gasped in astonishment. "Your Highness, you're back." All eyes snapped back to Margaret Harrington. The pink fabric of her dress was stained crimson with blood, almost entirely soaked through. Edward Harrington's eyes darkened, recalling the whipping she had endured 3 days prior. "Sister-in-law, why is your back bleeding?" James Harrington asked in shock. Margaret Harrington turned, glancing indifferently at James Harrington. "It's nothing," she replied coldly. With a slight bow, she addressed the emperor, "Your Majesty, Margaret is unwell and requests permission to return to her residence. I beg your forgiveness." Without waiting for a response, she turned and left. After only 2 steps, Margaret Harrington collapsed into a pair of equally damp arms. Looking up in surprise, she met Edward Harrington's ashen face. Ignoring everything, Edward Harrington swept her into his arms and strode away, leaving only a furious remark, "Brother, I'm taking her to change her clothes. Seth Rollins, bring the Jade Dew Bomb tribute to the prince." The emperor commanded his close eunuch. "Yes, your majesty." Seth Rollins vanished in a flash. James Harrington, now fully focused on his son, approached and solicitously inquired, "How is Lance?" Edward Harrington remained silent, carrying Margaret Harrington to a palace. Along the way, Margaret Harrington nestled in his embrace, equally silent. His embrace and Charles Stone's were equally warm, yet neither belonged to her. He set her down on the large bed and roared towards the door, "Someone." 2 palace maids immediately entered, respectfully saying, "We greet your highness." "Bring 2 sets of clothes here." "Yes, your highness." After the maids withdrew, Edward Harrington turned to face her. His dark eyes flashed with anger, his calm face resembling the quiet before a storm. "Why did you deceive me?" he began, his voice cold and gloomy, his entire being radiating a chilling aura. Margaret Harrington met his gaze with an undisturbed expression, her eyes calm and unruffled. "When have I ever deceived your highness?" she replied calmly. "How clever. Why didn't I discover this talent of yours before?" Edward Harrington said sarcastically, then angrily demanded, "Tell me, why did you hide your appearance?" In contrast to Edward Harrington's fury, Margaret Harrington remained remarkably composed. "I didn't hide my appearance," she stated coolly, "I simply prefer to dress this way." "Prefer to dress this way?" Edward Harrington laughed in disbelief. "How come I never knew my princess consort had such a preference?" "It's not too late to know now." Margaret Harrington spoke calmly. She knew that after today's events, she would undoubtedly attract their attention. Regardless, she wouldn't abandon her efforts to save that child. In her past life, despite her ruthlessness, she had never harmed an innocent child. As the celebrity Lil Grace, she frequently donated to orphanages and often played with the children there. She loved seeing their innocent, bright smiles. Now that she had his attention, she no longer intended to feign timidity or weakness. It was too tiring and only led to being bullied. From now on, she would only be herself, the one and only Margaret Harrington. Edward Harrington was about to explode in anger when the respectful voice of a palace maid came from outside the door. "Your Highness, the clothes have arrived." "Enter," Edward Harrington said, suppressing his anger. The palace maid entered, carrying 2 sets of magnificent clothing. Ignoring Margaret Harrington, Edward Harrington allowed the maids to attend to him as he changed. "You may leave." "I can do it myself," Margaret Harrington said in a low voice as the 2 palace maids moved forward to help her change. Unlike Edward Harrington, she didn't enjoy having strangers see her body. The 2 palace maids looked uncertainly towards Edward Harrington. Just as he was about to speak, Seth Rollins's voice came from the doorway. "Lord Harrington, His Majesty has instructed me to deliver medicine to the princess consort." "Enter." "Your Highness, this is the Jade Dew Bomb, a tribute from the western regions, bestowed upon the princess consort by His Majesty," Seth Rollins said respectfully. "All right, you may leave." Edward Harrington said with a grim expression, then glanced at the court ladies standing beside him and added, "All of you, leave." "Yes, your servant will take her leave." "Your servant will take his leave." After everyone had left, Edward Harrington looked at Margaret Harrington and coldly said, "Take off your clothes. I'll apply the medicine for you." "There's no need. I can do it myself," Margaret Harrington replied coldly. "Take them off." Edward Harrington roared, his face turning pale. This woman was truly unreasonable. "No need." Margaret Harrington stubbornly retorted, her expression indifferent. Edward Harrington glared at her furiously for a moment, then suddenly stepped forward, flipped her over, and roughly tore the clothes from her back. Hiss. The separation of cloth and skin caused Margaret Harrington to gasp in pain. Edward Harrington was stunned by the sight before him. Margaret Harrington's entire back was a mass of overlapping wounds, flesh and blood mingled together, skin peeled back, and covered in gore. It was a truly gruesome sight. "This woman. Do you not feel pain?" Edward Harrington roared angrily. He hadn't expected such a horrific array of wounds beneath her calm exterior, and she had even risked her life to save someone. Did she not feel any pain? Margaret Harrington found his reaction puzzling. He wasn't the one injured, so why was he so agitated? "The medicine I gave you, did you not use it?" he demanded. "Medicine?" Right, it was the medicine that man had given her that night. She didn't know where she had thrown it. These superficial wounds were nothing to worry about, they would heal on their own in a few days. Why make such a fuss? "It's gone," she replied dejectedly. Edward Harrington was choked with anger. He furiously grabbed the Jade Dew Bomb and applied it to her back. The skin on her back should have been smooth as jade, fragile to the touch. Yet now, it was covered in wounds. He couldn't understand why he had ordered her to be flogged before, such a frail woman. Carefully applying the medicine, he searched for bandages to wrap around her wounds. As he bandaged her, he had to reach around her chest, his large hands inadvertently brushing against her skin, causing Margaret Harrington to feel deeply embarrassed. Finally, the bandaging was finished. Without a word, Edward Harrington removed her soaked clothes and dressed her in a clean, fresh set. His sudden gentleness made Margaret Harrington uncomfortable, but she obediently didn't resist. This arrogant man was not easy to deal with when angered, so it was better to be humble. After all, living under another's roof, she had no choice but to lower her head. After changing her clothes, he placed her on the bed. Seeing the faint blush rise on her beautiful face, her cherry lips full and alluring, Edward Harrington couldn't resist lowering his head and kissing her enticing lips. The unfamiliar sensation on her lips startled Margaret Harrington. When she realized what had happened, her slightly embarrassed face instantly turned icy, her eyes cold as ice. Are all men like this? Forever enamored only with a woman's beautiful face? Without beauty, which of them would bother to care? Are all men like this? She suddenly pushed Edward Harrington away, her voice calm, "Your Highness, the banquet is about to begin." Rejected, Edward Harrington's face darkened, a flicker of anger in his eyes. "I know." Margaret Harrington let her long hair cascade onto the bed as she sat before a bronze mirror, gazing at her devastatingly beautiful reflection. Her delicate brows furrowed slightly. She reached for a box of face powder, intending to apply it, but a large hand suddenly snatched it away. "Don't put on that rubbish again," Edward Harrington commanded, his tone sharp with displeasure. Margaret Harrington glanced at the scowling Edward Harrington beside her and finally conceded. Taking a towel, she dried her hair, speaking casually, "Don't be angry, my lord. I simply don't wish for this face to cause trouble." "Am I also trouble?" he questioned coldly. "Of course, you're trouble, a big one at that," Margaret Harrington thought to herself, wisely keeping her mouth shut. Her frail body couldn't withstand the consequences of his wrath. "Of course not, my lord. You're being paranoid," she replied softly. Her hair now dry, she skillfully arranged it, securing it with a jade hairpin from the table. "Not," Edward Harrington repeated coldly. "Not, indeed." He could tell just from her calm, unruffled tone. Chapter 25 Confession, His Majesty has arrived. A loud voice boomed from outside. Both looked towards the door as it was pushed open, and His Majesty strode in. "Your Majesty," Edward Harrington bowed. "Greetings, Your Majesty." Margaret Harrington rose and curtsied slightly. James Harrington dismissed Seth Rollins and approached them. "Rise. We are family, there's no need for such formalities when we're alone." "Yes, Your Majesty," Edward Harrington replied, his expression softening. "Margaret is injured, let's sit and talk," James Harrington said, then looked at Margaret Harrington and asked, "Margaret, may I address you as such?" Edward Harrington immediately looked displeased. Margaret Harrington sat down, her voice cold, "As you wish." "Good," James Harrington said cheerfully. "I came to thank you. Thanks to you today, my 2 children were saved from danger." "Brother, there's no need to thank her, it was her duty," Edward Harrington interrupted. "Edward, we should thank her. Without Margaret, just the 2 of us couldn't have saved the children." James Harrington looked at his brother, then turned to Margaret Harrington. "I find it strange, how does Margaret know how to swim, and so quickly?" Edward Harrington also looked at her questioningly. Indeed, she was a noblewoman, confined to the women's quarters, knowing how to swim was already odd, but how could she swim so fast, even injured, leaving 2 strong men like them far behind? Margaret Harrington lowered her eyes and replied softly, "I fell into the water when I was young, so I learned to swim. As for swimming fast or slow, I was just afraid of dying." This perfunctory answer displeased Edward Harrington, but James Harrington just smiled gently and asked, "The way Margaret saved them today was peculiar." I've never heard of it. Where did you learn it? Margaret Harrington raised her head, calmly looking at the two men before her, knowing he was referring to artificial respiration, but she couldn't explain it to them. After a moment, she simply said, "From a book." From a book? What book? I've never seen it, Edward Harrington said, dissatisfied with her answer. I've forgotten. Margaret Harrington looked at him, her casual two words infuriating. You. Edward Harrington felt the veins on his forehead throbbing, truly angry enough to strangle her. Edward, James Harrington called, using his eyes to stop his brother's anger. Seeing his brother's warning, Edward Harrington fell silent, sitting down angrily. It seemed Edward Harrington listened to his brother. Only in front of James Harrington did he not resemble the cold, fearsome prince. Margaret Harrington thought to herself. I see a wound on your back. How did that happen? Is it serious? The Emperor changed the subject. Just a scratch from a branch underwater, it's nothing, Margaret Harrington replied calmly. Edward Harrington frowned at her. Why was her expression always so calm, her eyes always so indifferent, as if she didn't care about anything? That's good, James Harrington said. You saved the crown prince and princess, I will reward. Achoo! A sudden sneeze interrupted James Harrington. Margaret Harrington rubbed her nose and said, Your Majesty, I'm not feeling well, I'm afraid I can't attend the mid-autumn banquet. Could you allow me to return to the manor? James Harrington looked at her, hesitated, and finally said, If Margaret is unwell, then return to the manor. Thank you, Your Majesty. She didn't want to stay here to be scrutinized by the two brothers, it was better to leave early. Edward, the banquet is about to begin, let's go. James Harrington looked at Edward Harrington. Edward Harrington nodded and said to Margaret Harrington, I'll have Henry Fletcher escort you back. Then he followed the Emperor out. In the corridor, James Harrington stopped and looked at Edward Harrington. Edward, this person, is she really Margaret Harrington? Why is she so different from what you described? Not only beautiful, but also very casual, not valuing anything. Even towards him, the Emperor, she didn't show much respect. I can't figure it out either, why did she suddenly change, or were the rumors false? Edward Harrington said, his face grim. Could she be one of Mother's people? James Harrington asked hesitantly, then said, You must investigate her thoroughly, I don't want you to get hurt. His concern was evident. Edward Harrington was touched and said, Brother, don't worry, I will. James Harrington nodded. Mother must have arrived, let's go. Edward Harrington's face darkened, a complex look flashing in his eyes. Was she one of his mother's people? Edward Harrington returned to the manor in the late afternoon. As soon as he arrived, he went straight to Falling Lotus Pavilion. Margaret Harrington was leaning against the bed reading when Lillian Moore rushed in, stammering, Miss, the prince is here. Margaret Harrington didn't move, but sighed inwardly. This girl was too excitable. Since being punished, she had been blaming herself, heartbroken at not being taken to the palace banquet, and worried sick when she was brought back early. Shaking her head helplessly, she was still too young to be composed. Miss, the prince is here. Seeing Margaret Harrington not reacting, Lillian Moore called again. I know, you may leave, Margaret Harrington said coldly. Yes, miss, Lillian Moore replied disappointedly, turning to leave. She didn't understand, the prince finally came to Falling Lotus Pavilion, why wasn't Miss happy at all? As soon as Lillian Moore left, Edward Harrington pushed the door open and entered. Margaret Harrington pretended not to see him, her eyes still glued to the book in her hand. At this moment, Margaret Harrington wasn't wearing any makeup, her natural face was breathtakingly beautiful. Willow brows, phoenix eyes, red lips and white teeth, skin as white as snow, brows like ink, elegant and otherworldly. Her long, waterfall-like hair wasn't tied up, but flowed down, a few soft strands scattered on her shoulders, charming but not vulgar, looking incredibly alluring. Looking at her exquisite face, Edward Harrington suddenly remembered the beautiful face he saw on their wedding night. He thought it was a dream then, but unexpectedly it was real. He stepped forward and snatched the book from her hand, looked at the cover, and read aloud, "A Brief History of the Wind Cloud Empire." Then he looked at her, puzzled. "They all say the second miss of the Charles Harrington family is ignorant and illiterate. It turns out it's not true. Your Highness also said it was rumor, so you should know rumors can't be fully trusted," Margaret Harrington said coldly. She was just looking at the history of the Wind Cloud Empire. The traditional characters were quite tiring to read. Sharp tongue. "My dear wife, I truly underestimated you." Edward Harrington threw the book on the table, mockingly. Margaret Harrington sat up straight and looked at Edward Harrington seriously. "I know your Highness has many questions you want to ask me, and it just so happens I also have something to tell your Highness. Please sit, let's talk clearly." Edward Harrington looked at her in surprise, unexpected by her directness, and even more surprised that she calmly looked him in the eye. For many years, no woman had dared to look him directly in the eyes like this. He was very curious about what she would say, so he sat down on the chair by the table. Margaret Harrington got off the bed and sat opposite him. "Tell me, who are you really?" Edward Harrington asked, his face grim. "To be precise, I am not Margaret Harrington, but this body is indeed Margaret Harrington's," Margaret Harrington said, inwardly admiring Edward Harrington for guessing she wasn't the same Margaret Harrington as before. She had thought long and hard and decided to tell him the truth. She was tired of wearing Margaret Harrington's mask. "What do you mean?" Edward Harrington asked darkly. How could she explain this? This was inherently unbelievable. If it hadn't happened to her, she wouldn't have believed it either. After a moment of thought, she asked, "Your Highness, are you familiar with soul transmigration?" Edward Harrington didn't speak, just looked at her darkly. What was this woman trying to say? Seeing him unmoved, Margaret Harrington sighed inwardly and continued, "Your Highness must know that the second miss of the Harrington family attempted suicide before her marriage. Actually, she died at that time, but her body was taken over by me. Or rather, my soul entered her body. Do you understand?" Margaret Harrington looked at Edward Harrington with sparkling eyes, making him momentarily stunned. This woman was truly beautiful. But he immediately regained his composure, inwardly annoyed at being captivated by her. "What are you trying to say?" Edward Harrington frowned, irritated. Margaret Harrington realized how difficult communicating with these ancient folk was. Patiently, she explained, "What I mean is, I'm not the Margaret Harrington you knew. I'm only inhabiting her body. I know nothing about her past and won't do anything to harm you, so please stop bothering me. Furthermore, I'm not the Margaret Harrington, nor the princess you intended to marry. I'm free to leave whenever I choose, and you have no right to stop me. Do you understand now?" Edward Harrington's expression darkened with each word, finally settling into a glacial mask, his eyes blazing with barely contained fury. "Are you saying you're not my princess and want me to give you a letter of divorce so you can leave?" A letter of divorce is just a piece of paper to me, Your Highness. If I want to leave, no one can stop me, Margaret Harrington stated flatly, meeting his gaze despite being held captive in his embrace. "Then why fabricate all these lies? To lower my guard so you can spy on me more easily?" "Your Highness, believe it or not, everything I've said is true," Margaret Harrington said coldly, attempting to push his hand away from her chin, but failing to break free from his powerful grip. Finally, she gave up. "The Empress Dowager asked me to watch you, but I don't want to. I just want a peaceful life, not to be anyone's puppet." He'd been watching her for 2 months, how could he not know these things? A crack appeared in Edward Harrington's icy facade. He looked at her beautiful face and asked, "You say you're not Margaret Harrington. Then who are you? Where do you come from?" "I'm from another world, a beautiful, prosperous place. It would take Windcloud Empire perhaps 1,000 years to reach that level of development. Recalling her past, Margaret Harrington's eyes dimmed, a hint of sorrow in her voice. That world was her heartache. Do you think I'd believe you? Looking at her downcast face, a strange discomfort stirred within Edward Harrington. He instinctively resisted belief, sensing it would put an insurmountable distance between them. I've already said it, believe what you will. Margaret Harrington snapped, exasperated. This stubborn ancient fool. After all she'd said, he still didn't believe her. Talking to him was like playing the lute for a water buffalo. Seeing her delicate white face flush with anger, a captivating sight that made him want to kiss her, Edward Harrington couldn't resist. He claimed her lips, declaring his possession with a domineering kiss. Whether you're lying or telling the truth, you are Margaret Harrington, my woman, and you'll never escape me. His overbearing nature sealed her fate. Trapped in Edward Harrington's forceful kiss, Margaret Harrington thought helplessly, what an arrogant, high-handed man. His kiss was deep and possessive, just like him. She pushed against him, only fueling his anger. His arms tightened around her, making it hard to breathe. The wound on her back throbbed where he pressed against it. Her fists beat against him like pebbles tossed into the sea, causing no ripples. In that moment, Margaret Harrington felt the stark reality of her situation. Her exceptional skills from her past life were useless against these ancient warriors. She felt utterly powerless, terrified by the lack of control. Chapter 26, Mid-Autumn Night. Amidst the chaos, she recalled her past life, the first time she lost her innocence. Like many others, she was taken by her adoptive father to a secret assassin training base. Each day, 15 hours were spent in brutal, emotionless drills, infiltration, abduction, demolition, camouflage, concealment, sniping, assassination, grappling, thievery, decryption. Mastery of each skill was mandatory. Failure meant death or starvation. Living on the edge of life and death daily, her resilience demanded she surpass everyone. Though young, she blossomed into a beautiful girl, with the makings of a true beauty. One night, her master led her into a dark room, and then, suddenly. That night, her innocence was stolen. She felt no pleasure, only fear, pain, heartbreak, endless darkness, and her own desperate cries. That night, her master, like a demon, ruthlessly destroyed everything she was. Afterward, she became a cold-blooded, ruthless, unfeeling killing machine, her hands stained with blood, forever unable to control her own fate, only finding release in death. Thinking of this, her heart turned icy. She pushed the man away, saying, "Your Highness, please wait." She didn't want to lose her first time so hastily. Edward Harrington paused, asking, "What's wrong?" "Your Highness, I'm injured, it hurts." She feigned weakness. Edward Harrington withdrew his hand from her back, looked up at her, and smiled wickedly, "Don't worry, I'll be careful, I definitely won't hurt you." Margaret Harrington glanced at the window, the sky had darkened, and turned back to say coldly, "Stay in your room tonight, don't wander around. And, this manor never celebrates the Mid-Autumn Festival." He then flung the door open and left, hurrying as if the house were on fire. Margaret Harrington watched Edward Harrington leave like a gust of wind, slightly stunned. What was happening? His words were so strange, she didn't understand a single one. Moreover, she had clearly seen a flicker of worry and confusion in his eyes. Something she had never seen before. Redressing, she lay on the bed for a while, then got up and called for Lillian Moore to bring dinner. After picking at a few bites, she dismissed Lillian Moore. Recalling the previous events, she couldn't help but ask, "Lillian Moore, does the manor really not celebrate the Mid-Autumn Festival?" "Miss, I find it strange too, but the servants say the manor has never celebrated the Mid-Autumn Festival. They don't know why, only that it's His Highness's order." "Everyone in the manor has already retired for the night," Lillian Moore replied, also puzzled. "Do you know where His Highness went?" "No. You may retire. Yes, Mississippi. Why didn't the manor celebrate the Mid-Autumn Festival? What was the reason? Was there some secret hidden within the festival? Her mind was a jumble, unable to make sense of anything. As expected, the royal family was full of drama and secrets. She didn't want to be caught up in their feuds, it was better to stay safe and not be curious. As the saying goes, curiosity killed the cat. Cats had 9 lives, she only had 1, and she didn't want to lose it mysteriously. After Lillian Moore left, Margaret Harrington looked at the bright moon outside the window, her heart in turmoil, and finally pushed open the door and stepped out. Walking in the garden, watching the full moon rise higher, her heart ached. The Mid-Autumn Festival, a time for reunion, but what about the one in her heart? Where was he? Charles Stone, did he remember her? Or did he still hate her? She was just an assassin, devoid of emotions, yet she fell into his love trap, ultimately dying at his hands. But she didn't blame him, nor did she regret loving him. She had killed his father, she was his father's killer, she wouldn't complain about how he treated her, she only blamed fate's cruel joke. Margaret Harrington, you are the woman I have chosen in this life, I will hold your hand for a lifetime, never letting go. Lil Grace, you are the woman I love most in this life. Margaret Harrington, I will love you until we're old and gray, protecting you all my life. Margaret Harrington, I can't love you enough. Those vows from the past now seemed so ridiculous, he must have known the ending when he spoke them. He would kill her himself. All those vows were just tools to make her lower her guard. Head bowed, she suddenly noticed an unusual sensation. It was a strange feeling. She focused, then slowly crouched down, pressing her ear to the ground. Sounds echoed from beneath the earth, mournful, seemingly the pained cries of a man, angry roars, and the heart-wrenching sobs of a woman. These sounds intertwined, as if emanating from hell. It seemed this manor truly held secrets. She was certain, beneath this manor lay a hellish realm. Thinking of the Empress Dowager's instructions to monitor any unusual activity in the manor, thinking of Edward Harrington's hasty departure tonight. Could it be? She unconsciously followed the direction of the sound, unexpectedly uncovering a secret that horrified her. Through winding paths, she reached a secluded garden, filled with large and small rockeries. Walking along the rockeries, her sharp hearing told her there were people ahead. Hiding behind a rockery, trying to breathe softly, she slowly approached the location of the people. Before an ordinary rockery, 2 masked men in black stood respectfully, guarding. After a while, she saw a hole open on the rockery, revealing a hidden door. From within the hole, 2 more masked men in black emerged, carrying a straw mat, something rolled up inside. Once outside, they carried it away in a certain direction. Just as she was about to follow them, a sudden noise came from the rockery, and looking over, she saw a familiar figure. Wasn't that Henry Fletcher, Edward Harrington's close guard? He was the one who brought her back to the manor today. Seeing her completely changed appearance, he wasn't surprised, but coldly warned her not to harm His Highness. At that time, she found it amusing, with her weak, feminine identity, how could she possibly harm that demonic duke? Why was this person here? Moreover, he was carrying someone on his back, judging by the shape, it was a man. Henry Fletcher was always by Edward Harrington's side, could that person be Edward Harrington himself? She couldn't figure it out, what secret was this manor hiding? Carefully concealing herself, she waited until Henry Fletcher carried the person away into the night before climbing down the rockery and returning to Falling Lotus Pavilion along the same path. Lying in bed, thinking about everything that had happened today, she couldn't sleep. Initially, she just wanted to live peacefully as a neglected duchess in the manor. Unexpectedly, she accidentally saved the crown prince and princess. Her true appearance was revealed, attracting the attention of the 2 brothers, James Harrington and Edward Harrington. She could guess that the days ahead would definitely not be peaceful. Since she couldn't sleep, she might as well practice her martial arts. In this dangerous manner, it was better to have some self-defense skills. She practiced for a long time, until just before dawn, when she finally returned to bed and fell asleep. "Miss, wake up, Miss, Mississippi." At Lillian Moore's call, Margaret Harrington opened her eyes, seeing Lillian Moore's worried face. "What is it?" she asked coldly. Usually, she practiced martial arts at night and woke up late. Lillian Moore had never disturbed her. "What was the matter today?" "Miss, the Emperor has issued an imperial edict. His Highness has asked you to go to the main hall to receive the edict," Lillian Moore said anxiously. "Tell her to receive the imperial edict. It must be a reward from His Majesty. Don't dare delay." She quickly got up, dressed, washed her face, and styled her hair, then went straight to the main hall with Lillian Moore. Today, she wasn't dressed in her usual flamboyant, luxurious attire. Her face was bare of makeup, and her hair lacked golden ornaments. She wore a simple purple dress, her face unadorned, her long black hair neatly tied up with a jade hairpin. Even without any jewelry, her natural beauty was astonishing. From afar, she looked like a celestial being descending to earth, ethereally beautiful and captivating. Edward Harrington was already waiting in the main hall. Seeing her, his dark eyes flashed with a strange light. Margaret Harrington calmly assessed Edward Harrington. His face was pale, dark circles under his eyes, unable to hide his fatigue. The edict announcing eunuch and a crowd of palace servants filled the hall, each holding trays covered in red silk. Several large chests were also placed within. Upon seeing her arrival, a look of astonishment flashed in the eunuch's eyes. He then raised the golden imperial edict high and proclaimed in a shrill voice, "How Princess Consort Margaret Harrington, receive the edict." Margaret Harrington stepped forward, knelt and coldly said, "This consort receives the edict." The eunuch unfurled the edict and read, "By the mandate of heaven, the Emperor decrees, how Princess Consort Margaret Harrington, for her meritorious service in rescuing the Crown Prince and Princess, is hereby bestowed with 10 luminous pearls, 2 jars of jade condensing incense, a tribute from the western regions, a 1,000-year-old ginseng root, a jade rui scepter, 10 bolts of brocade, 10 bolts of silk, and 1,000 taels of silver. By imperial command. This consort thanks His Majesty for his grace." Margaret Harrington replied, her beautiful face remaining cold, devoid of any joy. She accepted the edict and stood up. "Imperial uncle, imperial aunt." Suddenly, from the crowd behind the eunuch, a small figure ran out, calling excitedly. The clear, childish voice made Margaret Harrington pause. Following the sound, she saw a chubby, fair-skinned boy standing before her, smiling. Seeing Margaret Harrington's puzzled look, the boy pouted and said with a hint of grievance, "Imperial aunt, don't you recognize Lance?" The boy's small, aggrieved face was adorable, and Margaret Harrington couldn't help but smile. "Are you the little boy who fell into the water?" "Yes, yes." The boy nodded enthusiastically, a bright smile blooming on his small face. "Lance came here today to thank Imperial Aunt. If it weren't for you, I would have died." The boy spoke seriously, then bowed and knelt, saying, "Lance thanks Imperial Aunt for saving my life. Get up quickly." Margaret Harrington hurriedly squatted down, helped the boy up, pinched his chubby cheeks, and said with a smile, "You don't need to thank me. You're so adorable, anyone would have saved you." "Really?" the boy asked innocently. "Of course." Margaret Harrington replied with a smile. "Imperial Aunt, your smile is so beautiful, even more beautiful than the celestial fairies." The boy said with a grin, then turned to look at Edward Harrington, pleading, "Imperial Uncle, can Lance stay here and play with Imperial Aunt today instead of returning to the palace?" Edward Harrington had been stunned. He rarely saw Margaret Harrington smile. She was always cold, her eyes like a 1,000-year-old glacier. Unexpectedly, as soon as Lance arrived, she smiled, a smile that could topple cities, a smile of breathtaking beauty. Come to think of it, the first time she smiled was also because of Lance. It seemed she was very fond of children. He was lost in her beautiful smile until Lance called him, bringing him back to reality. He asked, "Does your father know you're here?" "Yes. But father told me to return to the palace after seeing Imperial Aunt." "But Imperial Uncle, I want to stay here, with Imperial Aunt." The boy replied carefully, his small hand tightly gripping Margaret Harrington's sleeve. "All right then." Edward Harrington looked at his hopeful little nephew, then at Margaret Harrington's gentle expression, and finally agreed. There was no other way, he was also very fond of this adorable nephew. "Thank you, Imperial Uncle." The boy cheered with joy. "You may return to the palace and report to His Majesty that the Crown Prince is staying here." "I will escort him back to the palace this afternoon," Edward Harrington said to the eunuch. "Yes, Your Highness. This servant will take his leave." The eunuch bowed and retreated. "Ah, I can play all day. I'm so happy," the boy exclaimed.